What do you think of when I say the word breakfast? You're probably thinking eggs and bacon, maybe pancakes or waffles, maybe cereal, donut, coffee. Those are all the things you're thinking of, right? But in the 18th century, breakfast was nothing like what we think of as a modern breakfast. Those are way beyond what breakfast would be. The concept of breakfast in the 18th century is very different, especially for the working man. Yes, the occasional person in the 18th century did have eggs and bacon for breakfast, but usually that was in a social setting. If you had guests over and you were eating all together for breakfast, then it was a special meal. And yes, you would bring all those special things out, but the working man is not in that situation. He just wants to get his stomach full to get him through the morning until he gets to lunch. And so the breakfasts were all set around that concept. And we can see those references over and over if we look at the books and the writings in the 18th century. Whether it's a workhouse menu for the breakfast or a working man's menu where he's talking about what he's going to need to get the day going. Those are all very, very similar. They always have things like bread and cheese, maybe beer. Oatmeal is probably the one that shows up the vast majority of the time. It might be called one thing or the other, but in our parlance today, we're gonna just call it oatmeal. They might call it milk porridge or pottage or all these great names for it, but it's just oatmeal. Here's a menu from a book that's about hospitals, prisons, and workhouses. What's for breakfast? On Sunday, breakfast is 4 ounces each of bread and beer, sufficient, not exceeding a pint each. On Monday, breakfast was 1 pint of beef or mutton broth, well thickened with oatmeal, and 4 ounces of bread. Tuesday is 4 ounces of bread and a pint of milk pottage. Again, just basically milk oatmeal. Here's the diet for prisoners of war in a Liverpool hospital. The low diet is water gruel or panada, which is made with breadcrumbs and milk, rice gruel, milk pottage or broth, 8 ounces of bread, butter, and for a drink, toast and water. In an 18th century book called The Farmer's Tour, they talk about a farmer's breakfast. Monday, he's going to have beef broth. On Wednesday, beef broth. Breakfast for a Thursday is just milk in the summer and milk broth in the wintertime. William Ellis talks about farm workers in the 18th century. He says, the men generally eat 5 times a day. At their first setting out, they eat a little bread and cheese or apple pie with a draught of small beer or half a pint of strong beer per man. At 8 o'clock in the morning, some send for breakfast. Boiled milk crumbled with bread, others milk porridge with bread, others posset with bread or bread and cheese. So far we've covered working men, maybe people in prisons or hospitals or workhouses, those kinds of settings. But what about rich people in the 18th century? What are they eating for breakfast? Now we do have social settings where they talk about these amazing breakfasts with all these eggs and bacon and all that good stuff. But most of the time, they're just eating a simple meal, and a great example is William Byrd III's diary in the early 18th century. He's in Virginia, and he talks about having breakfast, and almost always it is simply boiled milk. That's what he says. Now, he might just mean milk warmed up, like milk broth, or he might actually mean a milk porridge or milk pottage along basically oatmeal again. Here we have the breakfast of the late Duke of Bridgewater, an abstemious man, but his breakfast was a mess of water gruel. A very, very simple breakfast. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography also mentioned this classic breakfast of bread, cheese, and beer. And you say, well, now why do you have a breakfast of bread, cheese, and beer? Well, most of us don't want to spend a lot of time cooking for breakfast, and that's exactly what's going on in the 18th century. Most of these breakfasts don't take very much time. Even the oatmeal is called hasty pudding because it's a pudding that only takes a few minutes to make. And in the case of bread and cheese, well, you just need to slice them and drink them down with your beer, and your breakfast is done. As we continue to dig into the research of the 18th century, we will find the occasional very strange breakfast. And here's one that references drinking mulled wine and cakes, probably to get over a night of revelry. Sometimes when we're researching, we'll find some of the most interesting things in very kind of odd places. There's a book from the 18th century that has to do with helping people understand French and English. So if you're trying to learn French, and it's a book that's written with French on one side, English on the other, and it has a dialogue going on. And here's a dialogue about breakfast. Will you have breakfast? Is it time for breakfast? What will you have for breakfast? Bread and butter? Milk porridge? Water gruel? All that is children's meat. Bring us something else. There are sausages and petty pates. Shall I bring a gammon of bacon? Yes, bring it. We shall cut a slice of it. Lay it on a napkin on that table and give us plates and knives and forks. Notice I didn't have any spoons. You promised me fried eggs and bacon. Here are some. Eat new-laid eggs. Here are some soft eggs in the shell. This is a rotten egg. So an egg be but fresh, I care not whether it be soft or hard. There are many books in the 18th century describing the plight of the poor or trying to help them out, giving them recipes. And here's a recipe for oatmeal that tries to go above and beyond, but still be very, very inexpensive. It's called savory water gruel. That sounds good just right there, doesn't it? You take some water and oatmeal and then you shred in onions or leeks. And that's going to give you this new kind of flavor so you don't get burnt out on that same oatmeal flavor over and over. Imagine this dish that might be called milk pottage or milk porridge. It might be called gruel or water gruel or even hasty pudding. They're all basically the same thing, and today we would call it oatmeal. Here's the description that's in one of the 18th century texts. It says, hasty pudding is made by putting oatmeal gradually into boiling water and stirring it about with a peeled stick and letting it continue to boil in that thickened state until sufficiently enough. When it is taken off the fire, it is poured out into pans, into pots or dishes to cool and then eaten with butter or more commonly with skimmed milk. It is an agreeable, nutritive, and healthy food and is generally breakfast and supper for the laboring people in the northern parts. Let's make up a dish of this porridge or hasty pudding so we can try out the 18th century breakfast. We're going to take our water and start to get it to boil. Now, some of these recipes are a little bit different. They use a mix of 50-50 milk and water. But we get that boiling or just to boil, and then we slowly stir in our oatmeal, or in some cases we might use a different kind of grain. We could use flour or even cornmeal if we were in North America. But we slowly stir that in and it will start to really get a bubble and boil. We might need to turn down the heat a little bit and it'll start to thicken and thicken. And when it gets to about the thickness you like, we're going to take it off the fire. We may even take it off the fire just a little bit earlier than that because it'll continue to absorb those liquids in there and get thicker and thicker as it goes. When we think about breakfast, we're thinking about eggs and bacon. Maybe we're thinking about pancakes and toast, but this is the breakfast of the vast majority of people in the 18th century, and that's it. They're having this, whether they're workmen, maybe they're sailors and this is their breakfast. Even rich people in the 18th century, many of them were eating just this for breakfast. It couldn't get simpler. It's just oatmeal boiled in a little bit of water, maybe with milk, and put that butter on top. And if you really need to, you can add some brown sugar, but just like this. Let's see what it's like. It is really, really good oatmeal and makes a great breakfast, whether it's today or 300 years ago. This is a ship's biscuit. It's hardtack. It's pure condensed nutrition. If you take a family road trip today, maybe 500 miles, you definitely pack clothing, maybe some recreational gear, a laptop. You don't need to worry about food. You can travel and stop any number of times along the way. Gas stations, grocery stores, fast food restaurants, they are everywhere when we travel today. If you're traveling in the 18th century, that is never true. You have to bring your food along with you. You never know when you might be able to find food or not. If you're a sailor on the high seas, there's no place to get food. You have to bring along every bit that you need. And it needs to be able to last through multiple different kinds of temperatures, in different situations. It needs to be condensed. It needs to be nutritious. I'm amazed by the resourcefulness of our forefathers in creating ship's biscuits. They check off all the difficulties on this list. I even have a ship's biscuit here that is 10 years old and it's still probably edible. I'm gonna try this at the end of the episode. So what is a ship's biscuit? How is it made? Ship's biscuits are so very, very simple. They are an unleavened bread. We just take 2 or 3 ingredients. You just need flour, you need a little bit of water, and maybe sometimes salt. You make a very, very stiff dough, and you form it into these little biscuit shapes, and they're baked. And they're baked by the baker at a fairly low temperature and for a very long time. What we're trying to achieve here is a hardened disc of baked dough with almost no moisture in it. Moisture is the enemy of a ship's biscuit. It will cause it to get moldy. It will also attract insects. If this is dry, desiccated, there's nothing here for bugs to eat, and it just doesn't go bad. So it's easy to imagine a ship's voyage, and on board ship are barrels and barrels of ship's biscuits. How are they going to eat these? Sailors know when they sign up that this is the bread they're going to get each and every day. In fact, rations for a sailor every day includes a pound of bread. So they may get 6, 7, 8 ship's biscuits depending on how big they are. There are accounts where sailors don't even like soft bread. After they're used to eating these for a long period of time, they think the soft bread is actually going to be bad for them. All that air in the bread will make their stomach not digest properly. And so this is what they crave each and every day. But it's not just sailors that have to endure ship's biscuits each and every day. Soldiers are also dealing with ship's biscuits constantly. 18th century soldiers are in situations where ship's biscuits are part of their ration, especially as a substitute, and maybe not an everyday thing. Joseph Plum Martin during the Revolutionary War talks about coming up to a situation where they didn't have regular bread to give out, and so they had opened up a cask of ship's bread and say, take as much as you want. So each soldier stuffed all these ship's biscuits into their shirts and into their pockets as much as they could. As we move westward toward the Mississippi, frontiersmen, explorers, and settlers are using ship's biscuits as part of their provision. They are surviving on this very same thing. We also see it as a commodity used to trade with the Native Americans. Later on in the 19th century, during the Civil War, soldiers had to deal with ship's biscuit the same way they did earlier, but they generally referred to it as hard bread, bread, or hardtack. If you read in the diaries, you don't see the word hardtack showing up very often. I think they just plain referred to it as bread, and if they got regular bread like we know it today, they would say something special in the diary like, I got soft bread today. Through our time period where ship's biscuits become more and more important, the making of them changes. So early on, individual bakers are making ship's biscuits. Later on in the 18th century, it becomes more industrialized, and they set up bakeries right close to the ship ports. There are 5 or 6 people working on the making of ship's biscuits, and they might have 9 ovens going and teams of men making these biscuits. It turns out that they need thousands and thousands of them for maybe just an individual ship. So the demand is very, very great. And by the time we get into the 19th century, it's totally industrialized, and machines are making them from start to finish. You'll probably say, John, is this really nutritional? Now, Think about the flour in the 18th century versus flour today. These biscuits were made with the least expensive flour. Whole wheat flour, sometimes other kinds of inexpensive flours thrown in. In fact, probably much more nutritional than we can imagine. This was just meant to get you through the day. This was survival food, not trying to give you this complete wonderful nutrition that we are always thinking of today. People in the 18th century didn't have those same kinds of nutritional concepts. If we look at cookbooks in the 18th century, we will not find a recipe for ship's biscuits. They're made by the baker. They're not made in a house. And the bakers generally hand these processes down. They don't write them out. So they'll give it to your apprentice to make, and he'll make 1,000 ship's biscuits or whatever. It's also an industrial process. We do get descriptions of this, especially as the process gets more and more mechanized, and we get descriptions of the archaic method of making ship's biscuits. I've got a couple of pounds of whole wheat flour, and we're gonna mix that with just enough water to make a nice stiff dough. It's gonna take a little bit to get this incorporated properly. Mix it in a bowl, it makes it a little bit easier. I really want to make sure this dough ball is complete. It doesn't have cracks in it, any folds where there is any unincorporated flour, because at those points, the dried biscuit will fall apart. It will crack and break, and we don't want that. So we want this to be a nice, solid biscuits. If they fall apart en route, we haven't done what we needed to do. I'm going to try a couple of different techniques here kneading. One of them is to use our rolling pin as a brake to really work this dough over and get it to be very, very smooth. And once that's done, we can start to rip it up into those larger than egg sized pieces. After those pieces are made, we can form our little biscuit shapes. We're looking for a hockey puck kind of style here. They are turning out very, very consistently. Since this isn't an industrial kind of situation, I'm not selling these ship's biscuits. They can vary in size a little bit. That's okay, especially for personal use. As we're forming up the biscuits, realize that these are not going to grow as they bake. If anything, they'll shrink just a little bit. So we're forming these biscuits up almost exactly the size that we want them to be when we use them. We're poking holes consistently across our biscuits and all the way to the bottom, and we're doing that so that it releases the moisture throughout the entire biscuit as it's baking, especially if they bake fairly rapidly, because what will happen is steam builds up in the inside of the biscuit and it will just sort of pop the top and create holes and gaps in our biscuit. In one sense, that's exactly what we want, because we want it to be easier to eat. But in the case of a ship's biscuit where we want it to stay together until we're ready to eat it, we don't want any air gaps, we don't want any holes, and so we poke these holes and the steam will come out through those instead of puffing it up. I've baked many batches of these and I've used several different techniques trying to find the best way. These take at least 2 bakes, if not 3 or 4, or you can do one very long bake at a low temperature. That's probably the best way to do it. We don't want that steam to build up, so if we bake them very, very slowly, that steam has a chance to get out of the biscuit without it breaking and cracking. So I would say the best way to do it is about 250 degrees for 3 or 4 hours. You might need to bake them for a while and then lower that temperature. Maybe bake them for an hour at 250 degrees, lower that temperature. I've even baked them overnight at just kind of the warm temperature in a modern oven. Ship's biscuits show up in multiple different literary references. This is from Swift's Family Robinson. We refreshed ourselves with wine and biscuit, which we found in some of the casks. Whenever we have bread or biscuits coming out of a barrel, we know they are ship's biscuits. The trick with ship's biscuits is you can't just eat them. You will break your teeth. So we don't want to eat that. This is our 10-year-old ship's biscuit. I'll try this last. We have our ship's biscuits that we just made, and we can use them in lobscouse. So you can check that episode out where we just ate them in the Sailor's Feast. We also have broken up a little bit of ship's biscuit and soaked it in wine. And here we're using it like cereal. So I've broken up the ship's biscuit by pounding it and then pouring it into hot chocolate. And that's another popular drink from the time period. Let's start with this chocolate cereal. Probably needs to soak a little bit longer, but reminds me of cocoa wheats. It's actually really good. It's got a nice little bit of tooth and a wonderful chocolate flavor. The biscuit soaked in wine, I'm kind of surprised. You can see how soft it is at this point. It's only soaked about 10 or 15 minutes. This is a little bit of Madeira, very common 18th century wine. Very nice and soft, eats easily, and this could be dessert. So it's a bit of a dessert wine. You could soak this in water or in grog. Here's the big trouble, right? This ship's biscuit is over 10 years old. It's got all these extra little holes in it. I didn't make all these holes. Some of these holes are made by bugs, which is a common problem with ship's biscuits. And this one is a pretty hard one. It has been around this long, kind of a little overcooked, but let's break this, see what the inside is like. There we go. There's our ship's biscuit on the inside. There's some bugs in there, some little white larvae, which is a common problem in the 18th century. Sailors, they would tap the biscuits on the table to knock the bugs out or eat them in the dark because they didn't want to know what they were eating. But let me see if I can get a little bit of it here. Tastes almost exactly like the brand new ship's biscuit. Still, after 10 or 12 years, it's just as edible as it was before. Maybe a little added protein. Bread is important to all Western cultures, but it was extremely important 200 and 300 years ago, specifically to the poor. Bread is what poor people survived upon, whether they were in the country or in the city. There are several times in the 18th century there are crop failures and the wheat is so very, very expensive that bread doubles and triples in price. That becomes almost impossible for poor people to have their mainstay of food. So if bread doubles or triples in price and the poor survive on bread, what do? What do they use as that substitute for wheat bread? This really isn't a problem for the rich or the middle class. They will always be able to get wheat. Maybe it'll be expensive imported wheat, but wheat is available. They can afford it. At the very end of the 18th century, the British government saw the problem with this. They started doing research on what were the substitutes for wheat when you're making bread. They did all these tests, and there was a great book printed in the early 19th century, 1804, that talked about the art of bread making. And in that, they laid out all the substitutes for wheat. And we get an idea here about what they were using for substitutes. Sometimes they're new substitutes, but the vast majority of them were things that have been used for hundreds of years as substitutes for wheat whenever it got expensive. The research lays out the different substitutes and what they cost. Some of these substitutes weren't any better than wheat. They were just as expensive. Rice is a wonderful example of this. You can make rice bread, but in the 18th century, rice was almost as expensive as wheat, so there was no real reason to use it. Another one of these substitutes that seemed to be almost as expensive as wheat were white peas. And I'm not even sure exactly what they meant by white peas. Probably a type of kind of bean. I don't know exactly, but it was really expensive in the time period. Two of the least expensive were barley and oatmeal, and these were already a common substitute in the south of England and of course in the north of England and Scotland, where oatmeal was very, very popular. So that is what the poor had been subsisting upon all this time. They rarely ate wheat bread anyway. One of the grains that's mentioned are beans, and that's what I want to focus on today, bean bread. Or even in the time period, sometimes something called horse bread. And horse bread is very interesting. It's been made for hundreds of years, even in the 18th century, and it was made to feed horses. Whether you are going on a trip and you don't know whether there'll be fodder along and you need to be able to carry your food, it's hard to carry a whole lot of hay with you if you're taking a horse, but you can take horse bread. So they would feed specialized horse bread to race horses, to work horses, horses that are sick, or they'd use them in circumstances where they didn't have the proper fodder. Horse bread was not quite like bread that we think of today, but it was made by the baker. In fact, in some places in Great Britain, it was illegal for anybody but the baker to make horse bread. And horse bread was made with ground beans, peas, sometimes something like oats or barley, and probably no wheat. And they would use a very coarse grind. They wouldn't bother to put anything like yeast in it, and they would make these hard, dense cakes of bread just for horses. When wheat became expensive, then people, poor people who couldn't afford anything else, would have to eat horse bread. Using beans as a substitute for wheat seems like it would be pretty easy for bread, but it's not easy. Wheat you just grind up into flour and you mix it with your water and your yeast and a little bit of salt, and ta-da, you've got bread. But beans ground up don't work very well. In fact, some beans even have a kind of toxicity to them. So unless they're soaked or cooked in a certain way, they're not good for you. Beans ground up just as they are generally kind of have a bitter taste, and they don't make anything that's very palatable, at least for humans. Apparently horses didn't mind that much, so that for horse bread, they would just grind up the beans and toss it right in. But for people, if people want to eat a bean bread, then you have to kind of work on those beans. They have to be soaked, but you can't soak the beans and then grind them into a flour. That wouldn't work very well. You'd have to let them completely dry out again. So the directions that we get in the 18th century are to grind the bean into a fine flour and then soak that flour. Now, that's hard to do. If you just add a little bit of water to the bean flour, you make a paste, and you can't switch the water on it. It does not work, because what we want to do is change the water a couple of different times, and that'll take the bitterness away. Now, they were very familiar with this kind of a technique. They would use it on things like salt beef and salt pork to wash away the salt. So soaking bean flour can be tricky. We have to have a lot of water, and we just stir it a little bit and let that settle very rapidly, and then pour that off once or twice. The directions in our book in 1804 talk about putting our beans to soak for 3 days, changing the water each day. And then you have this sodden bean flour that you can put into your flour mix and make a bread that's 50-50, bean flour and wheat flour. There are a lot of different kinds of beans that are listed in the 18th century, and we could use something like the fava bean or a field pea, which is a kind of bean. We've got white beans and red beans, cranberry beans, all these kinds of beans. None of those were specifically separated out in our recipe, so we can try some of those different ones to see if some have a more bitter flavor than others. I picked a bean that's giving us the whitest flour. Some of these cranberry beans and other beans have a darkness from the shell of the bean, but I've picked a yellow bean and a white bean, kind of mixed them together to give us a white bean flour. Right out of the mill, the bean flour looks good. It's got a good color to it. It's a little yellowy looking, but it looks like your standard run-of-the-mill flour. But it's definitely got a strange raw bean smell to it, and I'm sure the taste would be very off. You could instantly tell this was nothing like a wheat flour, and if I made bread with this just as it was, it would probably just be clammy and have just a very strange, almost metallic taste to it. I'm working from the Art of Bread Making book in 1804, and it has a recipe for mixed bean bread. So we're going to start off with whole wheat flour and mix that with a little bit of salt and a little bit of barm here. And it's going to be a very, very dry mixture. But I've already got my bean flour that's been soaked. This has been soaking for 3 days, and I've taken the water off each day. And what I'm left with is a very, very heavy slurry that we're going to add into our flour, and that will probably bring along all the moisture we're going to need. In fact, maybe just a little bit more than we need. And we'll mix that in with our wheat flour, and it will end up being about 50-50 bean flour and wheat flour along with that salt, and our barm, which is the yeast. And we've talked about barm in other recipes. That has to do with the yeast that comes off the top of a brewing batch of beer that you get from the brewer. In fact, it's better if you get ale because then you don't have that bitterness of beer. If you're doing this in a modern context, standard packets of yeast that you get at the grocery store will work just fine. Once this is mixed well, we can go ahead and set this aside and let the yeast work. These substitutes have been going on for hundreds of years, whether it's the Scots with oatmeal or the south of Great Britain with barley, and more classically in North America, corn, or as in the book it's called maize. So corn in North America is what everybody's eating for bread. Sometimes they'll have a bread that does have a mix. So they'll mix it with rye and they'll mix it with wheat to make a high class bread that still has corn in it. Very few people, especially in that middle and lower class here in North America in the 18th century, are eating wheaten bread. That is a special bread and not eaten that often. Most people are eating cornbread. Our bread was in the oven about 30 minutes or so at 400. It was in the earthen oven, so it kind of started high and worked a little low. It did not rise a lot. I don't know whether it was because of the beans or because my barm wasn't as active as I needed it to be, but that's all right. This is probably exactly like a loaf was like 200 or 300 years ago as they're making bean bread. And it's interesting as we dig in that they were looking for solutions to this problem of not having enough wheat in 1804. But they had been having those problems for 200-300 years before that, and the solutions were there. People were making bread with other kinds of grains. This is one of those examples. So let's find out what this tastes like. That's the important part. And now, the smell, great, wonderful whole wheat loaf smell. But the taste is like a whole wheat loaf, but you can definitely tell there's some bean in there, maybe a little bean bitterness. Regardless, this is bread. This you can survive on. Those poor people in the 18th century, they might have had to survive on this, and it would get them through the day. It would fill their bellies. This is the solution to the problem of very expensive wheat. It's been 7 years since we've done our 18th century fried chicken episode, our first viral video, and I've been thinking about it every day. Will it still hold up? Let's find out. We did this recipe 7 years ago, and in the comments all the time, we get the talk about the marinade, and it is so special in this, the acidity of it and what's going on with that. In fact, this recipe comes from a marinade recipe. Basically, the frying is almost like a throw-off part of this recipe. It's all about what you do with the chicken beforehand, and that's different from what we think about fried chicken, right? We think, oh, it's all about the batter and what's happening with the frying. But in this recipe, it's all about what happens before that, what happens with the marinade. So we might think that fried chicken is classically an American dish, but this recipe is almost 300 years old, and it's English. It's found in the Dictionarium Domesticum by Nathan Bailey, 1736. That's right, 1736. So this is very, very old. The recipe is called a marinade of chickens. Cut the chickens into quarters and marinate them in the juice of lemons and verjuice or with vinegar. Salt, clove, pepper, chibles, or a bay leaf or two. Let them lie in this marinade for the space of 3 hours. Then, having made a sort of a clear paste or batter with flour, white wine, and the yolks of 3 eggs, drop the chickens into it and then fry them in lard. And serve them in the form of a pyramid with fried parsley and slices of lemon. So let's break this down a bit. There are a few terms that we might find confusing. First, verjuice. Now, verjuice is not uncommon. We can find it today. It is a kind of a sour, it's like similar to vinegar, but it's a sour juice that's made with green grapes or grapes that haven't been ripened. We're going to be using vinegar as the recipe suggests, and we want to use malt vinegar, which would have been the typical vinegar in our time period. And what about this term chibbles? What is going on there? Maybe you've heard of chibbles before. You can tell me in the comment section. Chibbles are green onions. Maybe they use that in other parts of the world. I don't know. But green onions, that's what we're going to be putting in the marinade. This has been bothering me for 7 years. You know what this needs? It needs some nutmeg. This marinade smells great, especially with all those spices. That nutmeg, it's really gonna set it off. It's fun to dig through the historical references to find people eating fried chicken. That's a lot more difficult. So we have a couple of examples. Nicholas Creswell, he's traveling in the colonies about 1774. And he mentions while he's in the colonies, it seems like he's eating nothing but chicken and bacon. Now, I'm sure some of that chicken was fried. If we want a true example of somebody saying fried chicken, well, Dr. Hamilton is traveling in 1750 and he's going up the East Coast. He is from Great Britain. He is in the colonies as a doctor and he's decided to take a break from his practice because he has tuberculosis and he needs to travel for his health. Now, he is a very sarcastic man as he's traveling and he's talking about the places he's staying at. And at one location, he says, I have fried chicken and bacon. He doesn't say that it was bad, which normally he would. So he must have had some great fried chicken at that tavern. Fried food can be so simple, and you don't really find that many recipes in 18th century cookbooks for fried foods because it is just that simple. It's almost like a throwaway line at the end of the recipe. Oh yeah, do this and don't forget to fry it. Most references in the time period will talk about frying in lard. If you need a lot of oil for frying, lard is the place to go to in the 18th century. They didn't have the plant-based oil or the seed oils that we do today, so it's lard, 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 and occasionally, if you're just pan frying, you might use clarified butter. The batter is very simple on this one. We have flour, we have white wine, and we have some egg yolks. So let's get this going. The recipe mentions the garnish of fried parsley. That's going to be fun. We want to do that though before. It mentions it last. We want to fry this up first. It'll give us a chance to test the oil temperature and we'll be able to fry this in nice clean oil. It has been 7 years since I've tried this out. I've had regular fried chicken probably 100 times since then, and I really want to find out if this does hold up. So I remember this chicken being so good, and the acidity in this marinade should bring some great freshness to something that's normally kind of flat because it's deep fat fried. And of course, this crispy crunch it should have. Let's find out. That marinade is really good. That really changes what's happening with this chicken. 7 years later, and this is as good as I remember. So good. What is a feast to a poor farmer? Is it a fancy meal you would find in the city? Is it the very best from his fields, or is it just enough to fill the belly? This farmer and his family were at the mercy of nature. It could be a problem with the weather, with disease on the crops, or maybe pestilence, or maybe just market conditions. Very few things were in their control. Today I want a victory for this poor farmer's family. We are going to make them a feast. In 1800, 2/3 of the jobs in the United States were agricultural. These people were working on farms, doing agricultural things. Compare that to today. Today, 2/3 of 1% of jobs are agricultural jobs. I grew up in farm country. There were fields on every side of our house, and we engaged in farming as a hobby farm. My father was a tool maker, a machinist, and yet he would come home and do farming on the side. So I remember planting corn by hand, running tractors, harvesting corn, working with livestock, and so many of the families around us were doing almost exactly the same thing. Men would have a factory job, and then they'd come home and do a little farming on the side. I've seen agriculture change in the last 40 years, going from small tractors, small farms, and individuals to huge sort of factory farms, thousands of acres, and gigantic pieces of equipment. It is a wholesale change in what's going on with farming today. The cornerstone for this family's feast is bread. It's not the classic white wheat bread, which is a high-end bread for the 18th century. This is a hearty bread made of 1/3 rye, 1/3 cornmeal, and 1/3 wheat. This isn't the lowest of the low, which would be just corn or just corn and rye, but with the addition of the wheat, this raises this level of bread up. This is a feast bread. This recipe is so simple, it's 1/3 of each of these. I'm gonna do about 6 ounces of cornmeal, 6 ounces of rye, 6 ounces of wheat. And for the first step, we need to boil our cornmeal in a little bit of water. Farming and farm products are the foundation of the economy in the 18th century. That's where money's coming from. This is how people survive. Not only does the farmer have to understand the crops, the soil, the weather, he also has to be an engineer. He has to be the fix-it man. Whatever happens, he's got to be ready for it so that he can bring those crops in. Farming is the most common occupation in North America in our 18th century time period. The farmer is feeding not only all the colonies, they are exporting food to the rest of the world too. They're helping feed the world even in the 18th century. A farm in the 1700s looks completely different than a farm does today. Farms in that time period were very small, usually something like one man and his family could handle. And they were growing multiple kinds of crops. So they would have 3 or 4, maybe 5 different crops growing in a season so they could rotate those around. And it was probably a lot more like a small market farm is today. So we can see in our mind's eye this perfect little 18th century farm, and we can idealize that and think about how wonderful and lovely it is. The truth is they had so many difficulties. The weather was unpredictable. They had no idea what was coming next. Is it going to flood? Are we going to have a frost? And then we have pests, insects that come in and attack a particular kind of crop, or we have disease. And that is happening all throughout our time period, making farming very, very time-consuming and difficult. It's impossible to have year after year of great crops. You have to be able to do something else. You can't survive on farming alone. The richest part of our meal will be a white chicken fricassee. And chicken is the perfect thing. It shows up in the colonies all the time in the 18th century, very, very common. And chicken is wonderful because you don't have to preserve it. If you're butchering a chicken, it's perfect for one meal. All the ingredients come from a local farm, whether we've got butter, milk, the mushrooms, the chicken, and the recipe is a very simple one right out of Hannah Glass's cookbook, The Art of Cookery. We start this off by skinning and deboning our chicken and then taking the pieces and stewing them over the fire in a little bit of water and milk. Once they're tender, we're going to remove those and create the sauce with a little bit of butter and cream and mushrooms. And the recipe calls for, yes, a little bit of nutmeg. You might think that the farmer is eating the cream of the crop, all the best that comes off of his land. But the truth is, he's doing just the opposite of that. Those things bring the best money. So the best animals or the best grains, those either stay for seed crops so that he has the best to put in the ground the next year or the best animals to breed from, or he's taking them to market. And he's eating the leftovers, the worst part of his crops. As I'm preparing this food, I'm thinking about the farmer 250 years ago. I'm thinking about the life the farmer and his family has and how difficult it is, and what it must have been like to be around the table, eating a feast just like this. I want it to be an amazing feast. To top this meal off, we have a little bit of root vegetables, some carrots, and also to make it fresh, we've got fresh peas out of the garden. On a small farm, dairy is one of the main agricultural products, but milk goes bad very, very quickly, and so you need a way to preserve that. We've got two main ways. We've got cheese and we've got butter. And today we're going to make butter in the very simplest method possible. We don't have a butter churn. All we have here is a little crock with a lid on it. We're going to pour cream into that and then shake it until we get butter. It's that simple. The life of the farmer 250 years ago is one of continual toil. He's working from dawn till dusk. And it doesn't matter whether it's during the spring, in the summer, or in the fall, or even when you get into the winter. He's doing something every day to keep his family alive. He's always got to worry about what the weather's going to be like. He has to worry about whether there's a problem with his crops or his livestock. There is never a time to rest. Eating a meal like this would be one of those circumstances where you could sit back and relax, maybe just for an hour or two, not think about those concerns of the day, enjoying the people you're with and the time that you have together. This is the Poor Farmer's Feast, and it is very good. What is a feast to a frontiersman? Is it as much buffalo as you can eat in a day? Is it the amount of supplies that you can carry on your back from the start? Or is it a fresh caught catfish from a stream? These men were in a situation where all their provisions might disappear with one false move. Today we're going to give these men a victory. We're going to have a feast. So who were the frontiersmen? This was a special time and place in history, and it took a special kind of person who was willing to go into this frontier and settle it because it was so amazingly dangerous and difficult. It didn't have all the wonderful things that you would find in a normal society. You couldn't go down the street and buy your supplies. You didn't have the kind of support that you would expect in a town. There was no constabulary. It was the Wild West. And so it took a special sort of man. The Scots-Irish coming out of the border region between England and Scotland, they were willing to live in this kind of a situation. This is a group of men who've come out of one area, they've come to North America, and they just don't belong. They don't belong in the society that is along the coast. They're naturally drawn to this area that is the frontier, that doesn't have the same sets of laws or even rules for conduct. In a sense, my whole life has been building up to this frontiersman experience. How can I understand the frontiersman? I bought this property and there was nothing here. It was bare land. I built the house. I built outbuildings. And then we started this homestead project, building the cabin and a forge and other little pieces here and there to try to understand exactly what a frontiersman's life would be like, walking in his shoes. So where are they coming from and what do they hope to find? They're coming out of places like Philadelphia and Alexandria, Virginia, and Charleston, South Carolina. And they're looking for a place that fits their character and that they can find a new life. That life isn't there in the big city for them. There are two very, very common routes to get into this area that is the classic frontier, through the Cumberland Gap or down the Ohio and up the Kentucky River. These are the routes where everybody's traveling. They make little settlements or stations along the way to support their travels, and they're looking for an uncivilized area where they can plant their roots, where they can find their American dream. So as we look back in history and we think about frontiersmen like a David Crockett or a Daniel Boone, we can glorify them. But they weren't glorified in the 18th century. Those civilized places along the East Coast, they didn't want to have anything to do with them. There's another misconception that these are rugged individuals going alone with nobody else with them. And in reality, they went in groups, teams of men, half a dozen, 2 dozen at a time, even family groups setting up. This wasn't a lone occupation. They were together. Today when we travel, it couldn't be easier. You can get on your phone, it'll tell you exactly where to go. We have these beautiful paved highways, sometimes 4, 6, 8 lanes wide, and we can go as fast as we want. It was not like that in the time period. You're going by foot with a pack horse. You're having to cross raging rivers. You're having to go across ravines. You're following trails that you're not sure where they actually go, and you might have to back up and find the real trail. If that's not hard enough, a simple injury, a tiny snake bite, or a scratch can lead to your death. Colonel James Smith and Nicholas Creswell both were injured as they were traveling. James Smith, he hurt his foot. He couldn't move for several weeks. In that time, every day, they were in danger of being attacked by Native Americans. Nicholas Creswell, he hurt his foot. People had to bring him food. He couldn't travel where he needed to go. He had to stay at camp. Other people went out and hunted, and he couldn't do it. If you were going by canoe, that could be treacherous. It was very easy to overturn these canoes, and you never knew what was going to happen with the water. The waters might rise suddenly because of a rainstorm 200 miles away. Or there might be no water in the river and you had to drag your canoe by hand over rocks. Wildlife was a danger also. In Creswell's journal, he talks about a buffalo stampede at night that nearly crushes 2 men, and also bears and mountain lions. So what is a feast to a frontiersman? It's interesting that the frontiersman's normal meal is the polar opposite to the meal of the poor farmer on the coast. The poor farmer on the coast, what does he want? He wants meat. The frontiersman, what does he have? Nothing but meat. He's got deer, he's got turkey, he's got buffalo. If you kill a buffalo, you've got 500 pounds of meat. What do you do with it? It's gonna go bad in 2 days. You're gonna eat as much as you possibly can. But what do they really yearn for? They yearn for flour, for bread, for cornmeal, for hominy. That's what's hard to get for a frontiersman. So these special items, those are brought along from the coast or from supply areas. And multiple times, Cresswell talks about the difficulty of finding those kinds of supplies. He's in Pittsburgh, they want to bring supplies, and they were only able to get like 5 pounds of flour per person. That isn't going to last very long on a trip. And so they have to ration that out. It's very easy for these supplies to go bad or to spoil. While Nicholas Cresswell was traveling, the buffalo stampede into the canoe, the flour gets wet and spoils half of their flour. And so they have to ration it just this tiny bit each day. It's something he wants so much to make his own bread, but he can't do it. He's got to use his flour in soup to make it stretch as far as possible. For this meal today, I've got meat. I've got both fresh buffalo and dried buffalo, something that they would do along the trail. 4 or 5 days after killing a buffalo, that meat is going to go bad. It's going to spoil almost immediately, and so they dry it over a fire using a Native American technique. I've also got a little bit of flour, just a little bit left over from our rations. I've got a little bit of cornmeal and also some hominy. So we're gonna make a hominy stew with a little bit of dried beef, with some of the hominy, and just a touch of flour to thicken it up. We have enough cornmeal to make an ash cake over the ashes. Life for the frontiersman was seemingly impossible. He had very few supplies, he was in a very dangerous situation, he had almost no support. But a meal like this at the end of the day would be a luxury. It would be everything he wanted, as much as he wanted, and if he had some of those special things that he yearned, he would think it was the best. This is the Poor Frontiersman's Feast, and it is very good. What is a feast to a poor prisoner? Is it a heaping bowl of gruel? Is it a lobster straight from the sea? Or is it bread and water, just enough to get you through the night? Prisons in the 18th century are one of the most grueling subjects we can study. I want a victory for this poor prisoner. We are going to make him a feast. I want to understand the real history of the 18th and early 19th century. And if we want to understand society in that time period, we have to know what they did with people who broke the rules. That is crime and punishment. What happens in the 18th and early 19th century is completely different than what happens today, almost diametrically opposed to what we do today. Today, we do a lot of incarcerating people. We put them in prison for periods of time to punish them and to rehabilitate them. But that does not happen generally in the 18th century. People are punished for breaking the rules by fining them. They might whip them. They might put them in a pillory, in the stocks. They might transport someone, send them to a whole nother place, maybe America in the 18th century, and in the 19th century to Australia. And they would also just plain execute them. That idea of rehabilitating somebody doesn't exist until we get to about 1800, and then there is a complete sea change. What does prison look like? Who is in prison in the 18th century? Well, people awaiting trial. Sometimes witnesses have to be held in prison in the 18th century. We have debtors being held in prison, and there's some fascinating studies about what's happening with debtors in the 18th century. They also have workhouses. Poor people who are destitute, they are put into a prison-like situation. And related to this, we have prisoners of war. How they treat prisoners of war in the 18th century starts to bleed into and change the way they treat regular civilian prisoners also. A perfect example of this is what happens with prisoners of war during the American Revolution. The British started to hold American POWs in hulks, or decommissioned ships. They started to use this idea a few decades later in Great Britain, and they had prison hulks for regular civilian prisoners. They did this because they needed prisons quickly. They couldn't transport people away to North America anymore. It takes a long time to build a prison, and so they had these old ships. They could turn them into an instant prison. They were very hard to escape from, and they held people very well. There are two main drivers of this change from how we're punishing prisoners in this late 18th century time period. And one of those is really kind of driven by Quakers, especially in Pennsylvania. They had an idea that maybe this corporal punishment, the idea of executing prisoners or deporting prisoners, that they didn't think worked very well. They had the idea that they could rehabilitate prisoners, that they could punish them in a prison setting, maybe giving them very small quantities of food, maybe holding them in solitary confinement, that this would change their idea and make them into better people. And also in Great Britain, we have this problem of them no longer being able to deport or export their prisoners. And so they had to have a different way of dealing with them. So they started to hold them for longer terms in the prison ships and in prisons that they built. But how are these prisoners treated? How are they fed? That's what we're looking for here. What are prisoners eating? That can be very, very different in so many different settings. Earlier on in the 18th century, before we get to the idea of the punishment concept, and we're just holding people in prison, well, most people are held in county jails, awaiting their trial. And if that's happening, then they're fed with basically whatever they can afford. Most people come in with a little bit of money, and the jailers are feeding them, saying, well, you know, we're not going to give you a ration. You're going to have to pay for your own food. So if you were rich in prison, you could eat as much as you want. And if you were poor, you might not have anything. Maybe a little bit of charity would come in, and they would feed prisoners who didn't have any way of feeding themselves. It is very ad hoc. It's very, very changeable in that early 18th century context. As we move on and we're going to put people in prison as a punishment, then food starts to change a lot. And people can't buy themselves anything they want. The rules change and they say, no, you have to deal with just the prison ration that you're given. Sometimes there's some flexibility there. There's certain prisons where each prisoner is given a ration of bread, maybe even something like hardtack, and then 1 penny a day. And they can spend that penny on, well, whatever meat or other kind of food that they want for that particular day. And in some prisons, they had a sutler, a single person who was in charge of that kind of meat or other kinds of foodstuffs. And that was very highly regulated so that the prisoners weren't cheated. They created this system because earlier on in the 18th century, jailers were known to steal whatever they could from the people under their care. They were in charge of their food, and so they could charge as high a price as they like. Food is part of the punishment. At times, nothing but bread and water. That is the ration, and probably not that much bread. In fact, there is a study that was done. They were experimenting on the prisoners in Great Britain in the 1820s, and they said, these prisoners are getting too much food. Let's keep lowering and lowering the ration until we see what they can survive upon. And it was a couple of years into that experiment, and they had to call it off. Too many people were dying, and I guess they decided that maybe that wasn't a humane thing to do. Again, prisoners of war are kind of leading the way in this prison situation, and prisoners of war were given a standard military ration, but lower. So because they weren't working, people that were in charge of the prison figured that a prisoner of war could survive on maybe 2/3 or half of what a regular soldier would get. In theory, they were supposed to get that ration every single day. Now, the reality is I don't think anybody ever got what the rules said they were going to get. Here are the rations set down by the state of Pennsylvania. And we have Sunday, 1 pound of bread, 1 pound of coarse meat made into a broth. Monday, 1 pound of bread, 1 quart of potatoes. Tuesday, 1 quart of Indian meal made into mush. And then Wednesday, we get the bread and the potatoes. Thursday, the cornmeal again into mush. Friday, we have bread and potatoes. Saturday, we have the Indian meal into mush. So just 1 day a week, you've got something with meat in it, and the rest of the time, it's just a simple bread and potatoes or cornmeal mush. We also have some documentation for New York in 1800. This is the food for 250 prisoners. For breakfast, a peck of rye, 6.5 quarts of molasses, 130 pounds of rye and Indian bread, and then the fuel for cooking it. They have that as part of their budget. For dinner or lunch, 17 ox hearts, 7 ox heads, 6 lamb plucks, that would be like the guts, 1 peck of potatoes, 3 pounds of Indian meal, some salt, a little bit of pepper, and then 110 pounds of bread, maybe that's soft bread or hard bread, and some herbs. So they'd probably make one big sort of stew out of that, again for about 250 people. And then for supper at night, 36 pounds of Indian meal for mush, a little bit of salt, 61 pounds of bread, a little bit of molasses. That's it. It is painful to read many of these prison accounts. The prisoners at times were held in community, basically all in one giant room. And they would be given their food ration, or they would be given charitable clothing, and they would gamble these things away. And then they would be left in the most destitute situations. If we take all that we've learned here today and put it all together, I think we can make a feast for our prisoner. Now, if we look at this 1800 New York description of what they're feeding their prisoners, they take very, very inexpensive meat. So ox hearts, ox heads, and they make a very thick broth. Now, they could probably use any kind of inexpensive meat in the time period, maybe even a lobster. And we're just going to take a standard meat broth for that with a little bit of beef in there. And mix that with potatoes, and then cornmeal and rye flour. And this will make a very, very thick and very inexpensive stew. That is probably the classic prisoner feast of 1800. So we're gonna start our stew with our potatoes. I've sliced them up into chunks. Don't worry about peeling them. I'm sure they didn't in the time period. We're gonna put those into our water and get them boiling so they start to get a little bit soft. I don't even know if they bothered with this step very much at all. They probably just chunked it all together and started to let it cook. But we're gonna let our potatoes soften up, and then when they are soft, I'm gonna put in our broth. And it does have just a little bit of actual beef in the bottom of it. In the time period, I mean, this might have been something as simple as pig's feet or whatever they had. After that's boiled a little bit and heated up, we can add the thickeners, and we're gonna stir in a little bit of cornmeal, and then we're gonna stir in a little bit of rye flour. And this will make it very, very thick and seem like an amazingly wonderful filling meal to any prisoner. No, we're not gonna add any nutmeg, but we will add a little bit of salt and pepper. This topic is both painful to research and to talk about. But if we want to get something positive out of this, and we do, many people in this time period are looking for a better way. They want a more humane way or a more effective way of dealing with the people that are breaking the rules in society. Maybe it doesn't work. Maybe they didn't find the best solution, but they certainly were trying. This is the Poor Prisoner's Feast, and it is very good. Preserving meats without modern techniques like canning and freezing isn't easy, but it was done over and over in the 18th century, and they had multiple techniques. One of the ways that they did this, that shows up over and over in the 18th century cookbooks, is potting meats. Now, we still have potted meats today, we just don't talk about them much. The potting preservation technique is one in which we take a cooked food and then we submerge it within clarified butter. This has been done with many, many food items all throughout the 18th century. So you can find fish that's potted, lobster, birds. We do pork, we do venison. It seems like basically any meat product that people were eating in the 18th century, they would pot in one form or another. And we take that finished food product and then we submerge it in clarified butter. We might turn it into something like a paste, but in other times we would take a whole bird, like a pigeon, submerge that in clarified butter and preserve it that way. It is a preservation technique that works for days and weeks, but certainly not months and years. It was done in small portions, not giant vats or barrels of things necessarily, but in small pots, something that might hold 2 or 3 or maybe a half a pound of a product. And sometimes it was done industrially. They would pot fish, and they would do maybe 1,000 pots of potted fish, but generally it's done in 2 or 3 pots at a time in a household. As we go reading through all these recipes in the 18th century, we'll find a lot of them include saltpeter. Now, saltpeter is potassium nitrate. Today, if you were going to use that, you would use a sodium nitrate. And the reason why they use that is to keep the red color in the meat. Maybe it preserves it also, but mostly here, it's here for the color. The recipe we're using today doesn't use saltpeter. The recipe today comes from the Housekeeper's Pocketbook, 1739, and it's called To Make Potted Beef. Take 3 pounds of beef, put in 1 pound of butter, half a pint of old beer, season it to your palate, bake it 3 hours. When cold, take off the top, and in the beating of the beef, stir in the butter. Then beat it again very well. Boil it over the fire with 1.5 pounds of butter. Put it into pots and set them into the oven after it is first cooled. Let them stand half an hour. The proper spices are mace, nutmeg, and cloves. If they had slow cookers in the 18th century, that is what they would use for this very first step of preparation. We are going to be using a Dutch oven for our substitute slow cooker, or our 18th century version of a slow cooker. So we take our 3 pounds of beef that our recipe called for, and we're going to do salt and pepper over the top of that. We're going to put our meat in our slow cooker along with our 1 pound of butter. We'll put alongside, and we'll pour our half a pint of stale beer, or cider in this case, alongside that. We'll have other spices, of course, but they'll come in later on in our recipe. We'll cover this up and put it on our fire. And I'll show you how to use a Dutch oven in this circumstance. So our Dutch oven is the slow cooker of the 18th century. It seals in the moisture and it gives our heat from all directions if we use it properly. It isn't as easy as just turning a knob like it would be today. We have to make sure that we put coals around the bottom, just around the outside edge, leave the very center of the bottom kind of open from coals, and then we can put coals around the top. And depending on how many coals we put on the top and on the bottom really kind of gives our temperature variation. And since we want a low and slow cook, we have to put just some coals. We don't want to just heap this up with coals, then it'll cook it way too fast and we'll end up with a dry piece of meat. We want to make sure that the meat that goes inside, in this particular circumstance, that it's not touching any of the sides. And that's one of the reasons why we're also putting those coals around the outside, not in that very center core. We don't want to put too much heat right in the center, right where that meat is sitting on the bottom of this Dutch oven. We also want to make sure to check it every 10-15 minutes. And one of the things we will do is pick up the lid with a lid lifter or a little hook and rotate it 90 degrees. We want to turn this lid every once in a while so that heat changes and we don't kind of get too much heat on one side or the other. So we might pick up the Dutch oven and rotate the entire Dutch oven 90 degrees and then rotate the lid 90 degrees so that they keep changing a little bit. And it's amazing what you can do with the Dutch oven. Dutch ovens are still an extremely useful and very versatile item for your modern kitchen and modern campsite. You can use them in a modern oven to get an extremely slow bake that holds in the juices of any particular kind of meat you're baking, and like a pot roast in the oven. This is an amazing tool. You can do fast baking. If you need to do a pie or bread, they'll do that in your standard oven or on a campsite, but you have to get used to your particular Dutch oven. They come in many kinds of sizes and thicknesses, so each one can be something to get used to. You might need to have a fairly thick layer of coals if you've got a thick Dutch oven, or still, again, a fairly thin layer of coals on the top and the bottom to do even something like an apple pie. After our beef has been in the oven for approximately 3 hours and it's nice and tender, it's time to take it off the fire and let it cool so that we can work on it. Once it's cool, we can take it off and shred it. And this one shreds nice and easily. The easier it falls apart, the better, because what we need to do is to turn this into almost a paste. Once we've got it shredded, let's get this pulverized down in. Now, this is not easy to do. In the 18th century, we're doing this with a mortar and pestle, and hopefully your meat is tender enough that this is easy. If it's not, then hey, a modern food processor will do this in just a moment. We just want to shred this into almost a paste. Our beef is shredded extremely fine, so we're ready to add in our clarified butter. Clarified butter is butter that we have heated up over the fire and separated out the oils from the milk solids and liquids. This is a food preservation technique. The oil of butter lasts for a very long time and it does not grow rancid. So the part of butter that goes bad are the milk solids. We separate those out. Once we have the oil part, we can add that into our meat. And remember the ratio here, it's basically 2 parts raw meat and 1 part of this clarified butter. So in this case, we had 3 pounds of beef and 1.5 pounds of clarified butter. Once we stir that in, we have a very loose mixture here, and now it's time to add our spices. Remember the recipe said something like spice to your palate, and then at the very end it said the proper spices for this are mace, nutmeg, and cloves. We're going to put in the amount that you think is best. So if you don't like cloves a lot, then you don't have to put any in here. Mace and nutmeg are a very similar pair of spices that are related. I'm just going to use some nutmeg, and I'll also add back in a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper to get this to just the right level. The goal here is to remove air from our cooked food. So the oil will separate out the food and the air in this. It's just like canning. When we can something, we're trying to remove the access to the outside air, and this tries to do exactly the same thing. This layer of cooled clarified butter will hopefully protect the cooked meat, and even at times, a paper cover would be put over the top of that to protect that even more. While it's cooking, let's talk about some of the confusing things in this recipe, and you have to have other recipes to help you interpret this one, that's for sure. We have butter that shows up over and over again. It's hard to tell from the recipe, is this the same butter as what's mentioned later on, or do we just keep adding butter over and over again? Well, we just have to understand what we're trying to end up with here is a layer of clarified butter up on top. That's all that really matters. How do we get this meat cooked? And how in the final result do we end up with, a 1/2 inch of clarified butter or 1 inch of clarified butter over the top of the meat at the bottom? That's all we really need to worry about. Old beer, I like the idea that we need to have stale beer that we cook this in. And we bake it 3 hours. When cold, take off the top. It doesn't even tell us what we're supposed to be cooking it in. Now, obviously, if we're cooking this piece of beef with beer and with butter, it needs to be in a vessel, and taking off the top means some kind of vessel exactly like a Dutch oven that we're using here. So what about potted meat today? If we go to the grocery store, we'll find these little cans of deviled ham and deviled chicken. They are potted meat. They have the same kind of meat on the inside, the same kind of preparation technique, even the little layer of fat if you look at them closely. They come in the same kind of container, a little shallow pot, And they even come covered with paper, just like they would in the 18th century. It is so interesting that we have this direct descendant and we don't even realize it. As it was in the oven, you could see it sort of bubbling and boiling. I can see why they called it that in the recipe. It's definitely driving out the excess air and liquids in this cooked meat. And it cooled off. It took quite a while for it to sort of solidify and give us a top like that. And in warmer weather, it might never solidify. So the paper lid makes every sense. Today, we're gonna store this in the refrigerator and we won't leave it for any great period of time. I'm expecting some great flavors here. You know, basically this is pot roast pureed with excess butter. How could you possibly go wrong? And then put it on toast. That is like cold pot roast, lots of wonderful, savory, buttery flavor, and you get a little bit of spice in there, but it's mostly very mixed into it. So it doesn't have one spice that pops to the top. It's not too salty or peppery. It really is a wonderful, wonderful savory spread. Really good.
What do you do if there's no place to store your food? My wife and I have 4 children. We have a big family and we cook big meals. After we're done eating, it's cleanup time and everything goes into Tupperware, Ziplocs, and refrigeration. But what do you do in the 18th century if there's no place cold and dry to store your leftovers? Don't get me wrong, it's not like they didn't have answers to the problem of food storage. A lot of people had root cellars. They would even store food in their well where it was nice and cold, or a spring house. They were preserving food with acid, lots of pickled eggs and pickled onions and that sort of thing. But this is interesting. You would never look at this and think, this is a food preservation method. What I have right here is a standing crust pie. Now, it is a pie. You can eat this whole thing if you want to. But these shells, as they were referred to, sometimes even coffins or caskets, they're a holding vessel. They're not necessarily meant to be eaten. On the day that you cook them or a couple days after, you might consume the whole thing. But actually, oftentimes, food is stored inside of here. It's sealed off, and this might sit on the shelf for a week or two before you consume what's inside of it. These little meat pies are so intriguing to me as an American from the Midwest. This concept is pretty far from me. Now, if you live over in Europe, you might be very familiar with this. The idea of using flour and water and butter, essentially, or some kind of fat, to create a bowl, something to cook in, instead of going and digging up some clay and making a redware vessel, I think it's brilliant. I don't know how somebody just thought of that one day, but this turns into a discardable, portable way to carry your food. So if you're gonna go on a few days trip, you make yourself a few pies, put them in your bag, they're ready to go. You're just gonna eat what's inside of it. And the crust you throw out along the way, it didn't cost you anything. You didn't waste anything on this. And you don't have a dish that you still have to carry around and clean and worry about. Now, the pie crust that I wanna make today isn't nearly as big or as fancy as anything that you'll just come across often in these cookbooks. It's from a new system of domestic cookery, and it's very simple. We're gonna take water, butter, lard, equal parts, a little bit of salt and flour, and mix them together. And it doesn't even give you amounts in the recipe. A lot of times they're just referenced, like people already know, use a standing crust for this. The consistent thing about them is that you need to boil water with fat in it. Today, we're going to use butter and lard. If you just have butter at home or just lard, or if you have some suet, you can use any of those. But I wanted to mix these two. And so we're gonna take 2.5 cups of flour. We're gonna add to that half a cup of water and a little bit more. So I just put a couple of tablespoons on top of that, but it just wasn't quite wet enough without a little bit extra water. Then we got 3 tablespoons of butter, 3 tablespoons of lard, and a pinch of salt. It's really easy. Now, because this is a hot paste, I went ahead and I stirred it all together with a spoon inside the bowl because I didn't want to burn my hands. Be careful if you're making this at home. Now that it's all mixed together, we're just going to knead it. We're going to knead it for 5 or 10 minutes. It's a nice consistency. It's really easy to knead when it's warm like this, kind of like warm Play-Doh, and it's actually very comfortable and soothing. So, flour your surface, knead away, and in about 5 and 10 minutes, we'll be able to let her cool down. After you get this all kneaded up and it's nice and smooth, you're gonna roll it into kind of like a little burrito. And then once you do, you're gonna cut it in half. And this is gonna become enough for both of our pie crusts. After you've got it cut in half, you're gonna take off a piece that's about as big as a walnut. We're gonna do this to both sides. You're gonna ball that up, and that's gonna be the top of your crust after we fill the pie, and we need to seal it up. And this piece right here, we can flatten it down, and that is going to be our pie crust. And that is what we're gonna use to form up and make a shell out of. Now these need to sit and they need to cool for a while, so I'm gonna go ahead and finish balling this up, flatten this out, put them on a plate, and we're gonna set them under a damp cloth for about 4 hours and let them cool down. When scanning through 18th century cookbooks looking for standing crust recipes, you're probably going to find a lot of really impressive ones, and you won't necessarily see the everyman pie crust. But this one repeats over and over and over again in so many cookbooks, word for word. This particular one is from London Art of Cookery by John Farley, and it reads like this. If you would make a standing crust for great pies, do it as follows. Take a peck of flour and 6 pounds of butter boiled in a gallon of water. A peck is 14 pounds, by the way. Skim it off into the flour and as little of the liquor as you can. Work it up well into a paste and then pull it into pieces till it's cold. Then make it up into whatever form you please. This paste is proper for the walls of a goose pie. We're talking a humongous pie here. And that would be an example of either probably a really fancy table that's feeding a lot of people or somebody who needs to preserve a lot of meat really quickly. Now this simple pie crust, it's not something that I found in a lot of cookbooks. I think that the author is anticipating that you understand how to do this because it's already part of customs. It's already part of what people do. Now, you do find more extravagant crust. You find crust with eggs, things that you might intend to eat the crust with, things that are supposed to be more flavorful and more fun and maybe even more flaky. But this crust, and the reason that it shouldn't be anything difficult to make at home is because you can't really mess it up. When we think about pie crust today, we think cold butter, nice flaky layers, don't work the dough too much. That's not how this is at all. We're creating dough concrete essentially, and we're not always going to be eating this crust. It's no big deal if it turns out tough. What we want is something that's structurally sound. We let these sit for about 4 hours. You can make them overnight if you want to and let them sit all the way overnight. The whole point is that we want them cool enough to be able to work and to hold their shape. So we're gonna attempt now to form this up around a bottle. Right now what I'm doing is just trying to mold this crust to this bottle, using it to create the inside hole that we need in the side of the crust, but not have the crust crack open. We don't want anything to leak out of this. We want this to be as airtight as possible. It's nice that this dough is kind of like the consistency of modeling clay. And as you work it in your hands, it warms up just a little bit. You can kind of mold it that way, but we're getting really close. And I think I've learned a couple of things on this one that will help us along the way on the next one. This fought me a little bit as I was taking it off of the bottle. I wanted to stick to it, and I thought beforehand I should flour this on the inside, and I decided not to do it. So I'm gonna put a little bit of flour in here, try to reform it and see what happens. A little trick that seems to be working is as you're forcing this pie crust to go up the bottle, pushing from the bottom with your pinky or with your ring finger and kind of moving it up as you rotate it seems to really be helping out. And then once you do that, then you can get it exactly how you want it to at the top, but you'll have enough crust up top to work with. These are looking fantastic, and I'm really excited about them because I've never done it before. It fought me a little bit. As you go, the temperature of your hands heats the dough up for the crust. And as you do that, it becomes a little bit more pliable and easy to work. Then when you're done with it and you set it aside, it cools back down and it firms up, so you don't have to worry so much about damaging it when you pick it back up. I want to make 2 pies today. We're going to clear the table off and get the meat ready. The first one is a Cheshire pie, and that's going to have apples in it. It's going to have some nutmeg and some sugar. It's going to be a savory and sweet pie, and we're going to try that one right away because I'm really excited. That's going to be really good. The other one is just going to be a pork pie, and that is meant to be preserved. We're going to set that off on the pantry shelf and have it in a few days. I'm whisking an egg up real quick so we can seal the lids on top of these pies nice and tight. We're kind of going to use this as a glue. I'm going to cover the whole outside of this pie with this egg wash. Now, I'm not sure if it's going to do anything other than give it nice color, but I do like an egg wash on my pie crust, so when they come out of the oven, they just pop and they look really pretty when you bring them to the table. I got these covered in the egg wash. I cut a couple of holes in the lid just for vent because there's going to be some moisture building up in there. Now, if you're making this in a home oven, you're going to put this in the oven about 375, and it's going to take anywhere between an hour, hour and a half. So just keep an eye on it as it goes. We want that pork to be fully cooked, and we want those walls to be firm. In this oven, we've got it up around 500 degrees right now, so I'm going to keep an eye on it, make sure it doesn't go too far too fast, and as we baby it, we'll get there. These smell incredible and they look fabulous. I'm so glad that we did that egg wash on the outside of them. They've got a good sound to them. They're ready to go. Let's go try them. All right, I'm ready to try this. It came out of the oven. It looks beautiful. It smells wonderful. You can see this crust is like, it's hard to break. It's thick. It is a vessel. You've got pork and apple both on the inside. Now, I'm going to go ahead and try a bite of the crust because why not? Let's see what it's all about. But I expect the apple to just pair really well with that pork. There's a little bit of sugar, a little bit of nutmeg in here. This is going to be a beautiful, sweet and savory bite with a crunch from the crust. Let's see. That is one of the best pies I've ever had.
Beef steak pie. Have you ever heard of beef steak pie? It sounds delicious, but it's not like you can go to a restaurant and purchase it. It turns out in the 18th century, it was incredibly popular in almost every single cookbook. It's simple, it's savory, and it's got a smell to die for. Let's make a beefsteak pie from 1747. I find it interesting that there are no recipes quite like this in American cookery today. Now, you will find the descendants of this in British cooking, the famous steak and kidney pudding or steak and kidney pie. But a steak and kidney pie is a lot more complex. It's got the beef in it, it's got the kidney in it, and then many times you'll have things like carrots or potatoes, onions. This is the stripped down version of this. It is just a beef steak pie. It is that simple. There's hardly any components to it. And in American cookery today, we still do have the chicken pot pie. That's kind of like that steak and kidney pudding. It has the potatoes and the carrots and it kind of a really thick gravy inside there. And in the 18th century, its ancestor was the chicken pie, which just has chicken and salt and pepper, and that's it inside the pie crust. So in a sense, we still have something like this steak pie, but it's so much more complicated. It's great to watch this dish evolve through time. They're a very different dish in the 17th century. Very plain. We maybe add something like a lot of butter, and that's about it. And then as we get into the 19th century, that's when the real changes happen. Onions added, then we get potatoes and carrots until it turns into that full pot pie idea in the 19th and 20th century. Beefsteak pie recipes seem to fill up the cookbooks from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. We find them all over. The one that's copied the most is the one from Hannah Glass. That's what we're going to use today. It's so incredibly simple. It goes a beefsteak pie. Take fine rump steaks, beat them with a rolling pin, then season them with salt and pepper according to your palate. Make a good crust, lay in your steaks, fill your dish, then pour in as much water as will half fill the dish. Put on the crust, bake it well. Hannah Glass in this recipe calls for a good crust. Pie crusts are easy. You can go out and buy a pie crust at the store. I guess that's okay. But what I want you to do, I want you to make your own pie crust. crust. It's gonna be so much better, and I'm gonna show you how. We need unbleached all-purpose flour, we need some butter, we need it to be cold, and cold water also. And the ratio we want here is 3-to-1 by weight. So I'm using about, let's say, 21 ounces of flour and 7 ounces of butter. In a modern kitchen, we would cut this in with a special kind of knife. In our 18th century kitchen, we just have to rub this butter into the flour, and we want to make sure we're not melting that butter. So we're just grabbing up little bits very quickly, smashing it together, squeezing it, dropping it, and then moving on to a different section. So just don't melt that butter. Keep it nice and cool as much as possible. I think one of the reasons why this shows up in so many places because it's so incredibly easy. All you really need is the beef, a little bit of spice, and of course pie crust. That's easy to come by. And you could adjust it easily. You could make a small pie or a big pie. You could use meat that was left over in certain situations. And it's versatile enough that if you want to stretch this out a little bit, you don't want to use as much beef, you could add those vegetables into a pie like this. The cuts of beef in the 18th century were likely to be tougher, so she tenderizes this. I'm gonna go ahead and do that with these cuts, although they may not need it. I'm also gonna remove some of this stringy connective tissue because it'll make it difficult to cut. Also, this is your opportunity to switch it up a little bit. You probably don't need the most expensive cuts of beef in here because they're gonna bake at a low and slow temperature, so it will make something that is slightly tougher a little more tender anyway, so we can mix it up like the recipes did in the 18th century. We're gonna stick pretty much with this recipe, although adding some butter that they do in many of the other recipes. But if it were me, I would probably take that water and mix it 50-50 with mushroom ketchup. That will add a lot of wonderful flavor in there. And of course, in there is nutmeg, and that finishes up a dish like this. But what would you add if you were making a beefsteak pie? Right before we put the lid on, we pour the water in and we fill it up about half full. We could use something fancier. We could use like a beer or an ale here. We don't want something bitter, or even a cider, but almost all the recipes just call for water, and it's going to steam that meat as it cooks inside the pie crust. Now we can put the top on. I've wetted the edge a little bit. We want it to seal because we want to seal in as much as possible. We put the lid on, we crimp it down nice and tightly. I'm gonna put 2 small vent holes. It will probably puff up a little bit with all that steam, and we don't want it to burst open. We want to have a little bit of vent there. The recipe calls for this to be baked well, so we have any number of ways we can do that, especially in the 18th century. One of the ways we could use, especially if we were in camp, is a Dutch oven or a camp oven. They're the slow cooker of the 18th century, and it's so very simple. We put a few coals around the bottom and a few coals on the top. We don't want this to cook too fast. We're aiming for something like 350 degrees, maybe even a little bit lower. So we would put the coals around the top. We would gently rotate this every, say, 15 or 20 minutes. And we would check it to make sure it's not getting too hot, and then renew the coals as they start to burn out. And we need to bake this as long as 2 hours. Depends on how big your pie is, really. So a smaller pie, you probably don't have to bake quite as long. We're going to be using our earthen oven, and that's a challenge too, because it's a long baking time, and if your oven's rather small, then the ramp of temperature is fairly quick. So I've got to start it and get it to about 400, maybe 450 degrees, leave it in there 2 hours. By the time it's done, the oven will probably be down to 250 degrees or so. So it's gonna take a while to bake this. In our modern oven, this is super easy. We're just gonna put this in the oven and it'll automatically keep that temperature at whatever you set it, probably, let's say 325, and a pie like this, at least an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours of cooking time. For either situation, the earthen oven or the Dutch oven, we don't want this to burn on the bottom of our pie pan, so we have to lift the pie pan off the bottom, and we need a trivet for that. We can use something simple like this triangular trivet, and that will let air circulate under the bottom and keep it from getting hot. So the bottom of our oven might be 500 degrees because the coals are right underneath that. We don't want it to burn the bottom of our pie. So trivet will work perfectly in this or the earthen oven. It baked for 2 hours and it smells amazing. And when I cut open to this, you can see all the gravy down there. So you almost need a spoon to make sure to bring gravy back up onto your served slices or pieces. Sometimes these things you just kind of scoop it out of there, put it on the plate, and wow. I put lots of pepper on here. I love pepper, and you can just tell from the smell. It's going to have this incredible beefy flavor to it. Whoa. That is intensely good. Crust worked out perfect, and it absorbed all that gravy, and the meat is just tender enough, just right. This is incredible. You and I are on a mission. We've traveled back in time to meet a very important person. Let's call him Sam. And he asks us, what do 21st century Americans eat at a festival? And we look at each other and we say, corn dogs. It's summertime, and no matter where you go, there's a festival or a fair. And at every one of these events, you can always find corn dogs. Sometimes you get a great corn dog, sometimes not so much. How can we make the best corn dog ever? Our time machine has landed us in 1794, and all we have with us are the clothes on our back. So we have to make this amazing corn dog with only the ingredients and techniques that we find here in the 18th century. Mr. Adams has just been elected governor of Massachusetts, and we want to celebrate. We want to make him an amazing treat. I had to do digging on this one. Finding an 18th century corn dog, well, it's not there. So we have to look for parallels in similar items, especially if we can think of them as street food. We have a phrase, which is kind of like a pancake with meat in the middle. That's getting close. We also have a German recipe from the late 18th century, which has a bratwurst with dough on the outside. That's getting pretty close. We also have something that's street food, which is sausage on a stick. If we combine all these together and we bring in that amazing American ingredient, which is cornmeal, I think we're getting there. Our biggest challenge will be the hot dog. There's nothing like a hot dog in the 18th century, so we're going to substitute a superior meat, and that is the sausage link. And if we're being honest, I don't think anybody's going to cry over leaving the hot dog behind. Each of the ancestor recipes we've done before all have a batter. And in this batter, it's going to be a very simple one. We don't necessarily have a recipe, but we do have some ideas about what to do with this. It's a simple batter, normally with just flour, milk, eggs, maybe a little bit of salt. Of course, since this is America and the 18th century, and it's a corn dog, we want to have corn in there. So we're going to mix our batter with 50-50 regular flour and cornmeal. And to make that classic corn dog flavor, a little bit of sugar also. So a very simple batter, and we're going to make the batter first so it has a little time to set. Let's mix our dry ingredients. We have 1.5 cups of cornmeal. We also have 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. Along with those, we have sugar, maybe 1/4 cup of sugar, and a little bit of salt and a little bit of pepper. We're going to mix those up until they're consistent within the entire batch, and now we can add in our wet ingredients. Our wet ingredients are 2 eggs. I'm just going to toss those whole in here, and about 1.5 cups of milk. We should mix those up until we have a thick batter. This looks like a perfect consistency to start with. It's going to thicken up. I'm going to set this aside, and I want it to thicken up for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. We'll adjust the batter at that point so it sticks properly to the outside of our sausage. Now remember, Mr. Adams never heard of a hot dog, that's for sure. And there's nothing quite like a hot dog here in the 18th century. So we're gonna have to make up a sausage. We're gonna make a pork sausage. We're just gonna take pork here and chop it up. They didn't have the grinding machinery that we do today, so we're just going to chop this up a whole bunch until we get to our version of ground pork. We'll mix that 50-50 with some beef suet and then add in a few spices. The next part of our sausage is adding the extra fat. Yes, we have to add extra fat. That's the only way to make a sausage. And the fat we're going to use is suet. Suet is a special kind of fat. We can't use lard here. Lard will not work, it'll just make a mess. Suet is a very high temperature fat. It melts at a much higher temperature, and therefore we can easily mix it with our meat, and as it cooks, it will disappear. It'll create little pockets in our sausage that makes it not just this dense chunk of meat. And that's what we're really looking for. Suet is kidney fat. It forms around the internal organs in the cow, and it is a completely different consistency than muscle fat. Muscle fat turns to oil almost immediately. You can't really make it harden up. It just turns into just a paste, really, and is not usable at all. This suet is a lot more like wax. And in fact, sometimes we use it for candles in the 18th century. And it is perfect for sausage. We're gonna set our sausage aside before we batter them to cool off. We can't just give Mr. Adams a corn dog, right? We have to make it something a little bit more than that. So we're gonna make a special something to go along with that. Classic fare food. We're gonna do onion rings. But these onion rings we've done in the past, they're so good and they're extra special because it's done with Parmesan cheese. The full recipe for this is 3 eggs whisked up. We need 5 tablespoons of cream. We need a 1/4 cup of flour and 5 ounces of Parmesan cheese finely grated. You can also add a little bit of salt, also some pepper. For our purposes today, I'll cut this recipe down a little bit. I really want this to be great for Mr. Adams. And this looks great. Question is, do they taste right? So here we go. Onion ring first. I love that Parmesan cheese in here. It is the best mix. A wonderful way for doing onion rings. So if you make your own onion rings, try out this Parmesan cheese batter. Now, the corn dog. This is the important part. We've got to get this one right. We've got sausage in here, and it's got that suet, which is going to give it a little bit of beef flavor. It's going to make it the right kind of fattiness. These look good in the pan. They should be even better in this corn dog. And we have the batter mix on the outside, that cornmeal mix. It doesn't have leavening like we normally have, so it's probably going to be a little thicker, a little crunchier, and I can't wait to try it. Look at that. It's perfect. Even though it doesn't have nutmeg in it, this is the best corn dog I have ever had, and I have eaten a lot of corn dogs. I love it, you're gonna love it, and Sam is going to love this. This is French toast from 1792. We think of it as a wonderful breakfast, but it's also a comfort food that's over 1,000 years old. Where did it come from? What was it like in the beginning? Let's explore the origins of this comfort food. I love the history of French toast because it goes back so far, more than 1,000 years. In the Apicius, which is a 3rd or 4th century Roman cookbook, we find a recipe for something that's called another sweet. Here's the recipe. Slice fine white bread, remove the crust, put it into rather large pieces which you soak in milk and beaten eggs, fry in oil, cover in honey, and serve. If we move forward in time, we get to the 15th century English cookbook manuscripts that we have. And here, this is really hard to read because the English in the 15th century was like nearly impossible. But it goes something like this. Take fair 30 yolks of eggs, separate them from the white, draw them through a strainer, take salt and cast upon this, take the fair bread, cut it round, and then take fair butter, I like fair things, take fair butter that is clarified or else fresh grease, put it into the pan, and so fry them up, but beware it clinging to the pan. When it is fried, lay them on a dish and sugar. So that's 15th century English recipe. Now when I think comfort food, I usually think inexpensive. But as we look into the 18th century and late 17th century, these recipes for French toast are in fairly high-class cookbooks. You'll never see it called French toast. Sometimes it's pain perdu, or sometimes it's cream toasts. Pain perdu means wasted bread. It's a great way of using up bread that isn't so good. You can make bread pudding, or you can make these pain perdus. We get a recipe in 1710 in Royal Cookery. This is a long and complicated recipe. It's strange that the recipe as we go through time seems to get more and more complicated. This recipe in Royal Cookery ends up being the one that's copied the most in cookbooks as we go through the 18th century. Hannah Glass copies it almost word for word. And it has this strange combination of soaking it in the milk first and then adding the eggs, which seems like a strange way of doing it. I mean, I don't think anybody does it that way today. The one I want to do today is a little more modern. John Farley in the London Art of Cookery, 1792. He gets a little more to the point. Pain perdu, French rolls that have been baked one day are best for this purpose. You want stale bread. Cut them in slices, have ready eggs, cream, sugar, and rose water beat up together as for a custard. Lay your bread in it to soak. Fry some butter, and then when it boils, take the slices gently out and put them into the pan. As soon as they are done, lay them between paper before the fire to drain. When it is all done, arrange them neatly in your dish as you would biscuits and put some sugar over them. I don't have any bread on hand, so we're gonna make a couple little loaves. We're gonna cut them up and let them go stale overnight. We've got the standard bread recipe here, which is flour, salt. We've got yeast, which in the form of a liquid barm, and then water. That's it. That's all we need for our bread. Farley's recipe calls for cream and rose water. We're going to substitute milk for our cream, and no, I'm not going to use rose water. I know some of you are big rose water fans out there. I'm going to use a different aromatic, and that is nutmeg. That's referred to in multiple older recipes, so we're going to bring that forward to Farley's recipe. It couldn't be simpler. Add our eggs to this and whisk them up with a little bit of milk, and then a little bit of spice on top of that. Soak our bread and fry it up. In the Complete Cook of 1662, we have a recipe that's called To Make Toasts. says cut 2 penny loaves in round slices and dip them in half a pint of cream or cold water. Then lay them abroad in a dish and beat 3 eggs, grated nutmegs, and sugar. Beat them with the cream, then take your frying pan and melt some butter in it. Wet one side of your toasts, lay them on the wet side, then pour the rest upon them, and so fry them. Send them in with rose water, butter, and sugar. This is from a high-end cookbook, 1662. We can tell by some of the ingredients like the rose water and the sugar that this is meant for a high-class table. While our bread's soaking, we're gonna make a sauce. You could use maple syrup, but we wanna make an 18th century sauce. So we're making a sauce made of equal parts butter, sugar, and wine. We'll be using an 18th century wine similar to a sherry. Warm this gently over a fire until the parts incorporate. They won't perfectly incorporate, but that's all right. You stir it right before you pour it on. This is our French toast, right out of John Farley's 1792, The London Art of Cookery. And while I was cooking this, I couldn't help but think that people have been making this same dish as comfort food for 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, more than 1,000 years. This is an amazing recipe, an amazing connection that we have with people in the past. The fact that it's in an early 18th century cookbook at all means it's a fancy food. Cookbooks were really only meant for rich people. This was meant for the well-to-do table, and the fact that it's made out of such simple ingredients and has been around so long means that it was most likely on poor people's table too. These slices are thick, so I'm expecting some great bread flavor in the middle, the egg flavor on the outside edges, and of course the pop of sweetness and a little bit of sharpness in the sauce that goes on the outside. A very, very typical 18th century sauce. Here we go, French toast from the 18th century. That sauce is so good. It's got a wonderful texture. It's very thick, very filling. So good. You and I are on a mission. We've traveled back in time to meet a very important person. Let's call him Mr. Adams. He asks us, what do 21st century Americans enjoy eating for breakfast? We look at each other and we say, Egg McMuffins. In 21st century America, you can find an Egg McMuffin on every corner. And unlike some of the other recipes we've done, each and every Egg McMuffin is exactly the same. So many people start their day with nothing but an Egg McMuffin and a cup of coffee. How can we make this even better for Mr. Adams? How can we make the best 18th century breakfast sandwich? Our time machine has landed us in 1796 and we've met up with Mr. Adams on the campaign trail. All we have with us are the clothes on our back. We have to make do with whatever ingredients we can find here in the late 18th century. Breakfast in 18th century America is not the same as what you probably think. It's not eggs and bacon, it's probably porridge, or maybe it's bread and beer. John Adams at this point in history has been a world traveler. He has experienced other kinds of cuisines, but he probably is ready for just a regular American breakfast. Some of this is going to be very easy. Scrambled eggs or eggs cooked, no problem. But what about the bread component and the sausage? We'll have to do some adjustment here. And the uniformity of it, that's a little strange for the 18th century. So I've made a special iron ring so I can make all the components fit in a size and shape. Let's start off with the foundation. What are we gonna do for bread? We need to make sure this has the right texture and a great flavor. As far as I'm concerned, the biggest challenges we have are the bread components on the top and the bottom of our Egg McMuffin. Now, we know them today as English muffins. Obviously, in England and America, they didn't call whatever that was an English muffin, and there isn't anything quite like it in the 18th century. But the precursor to the English muffin is likely the crumpet of the very late 18th century and early 19th century. They're almost exactly the same in their airiness and fluffiness, the thickness and size. They have these air pockets that go all throughout it, so the texture is almost exactly the same. Mrs. Fraser has a recipe called Crumpets for Tea. It goes: beat 2 eggs well, put them to a choppin' or a quart of warm milk and water, and a large spoonful of barm. Mix in as much fine flour as will make them a little thicker than pudding batter. Let the oven or griddle be very hot. Rub it over with butter. Pour as much of the batter into it as the size of a saucer. Do the rest the same way. Turn them. Make them very crisp. Butter them. This recipe should give us the best alternative to an English muffin that we can get. It should give Mr. Adams a great experience. I think this will knock the socks off of a modern day sausage egg McMuffin. The recipe called for barm. We're using the modern substitute, which is fast-acting yeast. The yeast in the 18th century was called barm, but it was in a slightly different form. This will work great. We're gonna set this aside and it'll be ready in a few minutes. Our next challenge is a sausage patty. Now, did they have sausage patties like this in the 18th century? They did, but they weren't in the shape that we need for this, so that's not too bad. The recipe is one from Martha Washington's cookbook. A simple recipe. We use chopped pork or ground pork. We're gonna add some beef suet to it that will give us a little beefy flavor and also nice air pockets so that it's juicy and tender, and spices. We're gonna use our special kitchen pepper that we've done before on the channel. Kitchen pepper is a combination of spices, and this one is going to turn out great. This sausage should have just the right spices. This is a breakfast sandwich built for a president. Cooking with this ring is a real challenge. I don't know if it's gonna get cooked all the way in the middle. And we've come all this way. I don't want to disappoint Mr. Adams. Here it is, our Egg McMuffin for Mr. Adams. Smells great. The textures look really good. It's ready to eat. Okay, this is a breakfast sandwich, right? We can't just have one breakfast sandwich. If we're gonna do it, let's go all the way. We're going to make a McGriddle. Let's whip up some pancakes. We're going to do a classic Johnny cake recipe for these pancakes. First, we're gonna mix up an egg and some milk. We're gonna add into that some melted butter. And to get that sweetness, just like the McGriddle, we're gonna put the maple syrup right into this batter. Not a lot or it'll burn. Then we put in flour and cornmeal with a little bit of salt. That's our batter. Here's our Egg McMuffin, and this thing, it looks great. I don't think I'll ever be able to eat a regular McDonald's Egg McMuffin after just seeing this one. So let's give it a try. I'm gonna have to, whew. So good. Such great textures. It is a whole breakfast in one sandwich, and this is the real deal. Real cheese, perfectly cooked egg, a real egg right from our chickens, and sausage that is seasoned to perfection. The McGriddle, and as you see, we got the perfect branding on here, proper branding, and I can smell the egg and the cheese and the sausage on this, and I'm really interested to see about the sweetness in the pancake of the sausage or the sandwich here. Here we go. Perfect balance. We did it. We made the perfect breakfast sandwich. These are even better than what you can find today. I love it, you're going to love it, and Mr. Adams is gonna love it. Welcome to Townsend's Great Frontier Cook-Off, and it starts now. Our contestants, Ryan and Michael, have 3 hours to impress me. They have to use certain ingredients: pork, seafood, and cheese. They also have to use 3 different cooking techniques: a fricassee, a pudding, and a sweet dessert. This is meant to be a meal, so everything has to come together and be served at the same time. I'm looking for several different things. Watching what their technique is like, what the food obviously tastes like. Is it good within a historical context? Is it just based on a historical recipe, or is it a particular historical recipe? And also how good they are at explaining what they're doing.
Good morning, I'm Michael Dragoo. I'm a historical foodways demonstrator. I've been doing that about 10 years. Young reckless Ryan has challenged me to a cook-off. I'm going to be producing some hors d'oeuvres, an entree with some support materials, and a dessert. And my hors d'oeuvres are cheese loaves and shrimps buttered on sippets. My entree is a pork olive. I've got a white fricassee of mushrooms and a potato pudding. My delicacies are, I'm going to be making wafers in a wafer press. I'll be filling them with a raspberry jam and whipped cream. My main concern is not getting them done, but getting them all hot and ready to eat at a given time. I haven't done that before, so we're shooting from the hip on this one.
Hello, my name is Ryan Kerr. My main objective today is to take Michael down. I've been working at Townsends for 9 years, and the thing that I have on my side is I know what food John likes. I've worked with him every day for 9 years. We've gone on trips together, we've camped together. I know what he likes, and I'm gonna use it to my advantage. What I'm doing today for the fricassee, I'm doing a lobster fricassee. John's not always huge into seafood, and I know this, so I'm gonna hide it in this super buttery sauce. It's gonna be good. And then for pork, I'm doing pork a la Norman, which is one of our favorite dishes. We've done it a few times on the channel. It's fantastic. Dessert's gonna be a white pot. It's also another fan favorite. And I've got some surprise cheese toasties to go in there too, which I know John loves. I'm giving him all of his favorite food, and I'm taking home the win. Okay, so the biggest concern here today is timing. We've got a lot to do, and a lot of it takes the same amount of time, but I have to time it so I'm doing pieces of it here and there. When everything comes to the table, it's still hot, because I don't want him to chew on something cold and rubbery, so I gotta make sure that it's all timed perfectly.
First thing I'm doing is starting my brazier. Need to get a bed of coals going. The first thing I'm making is a force meat. I've collected some gravies. In this time period, gravy isn't like your grandma's thick gravy for Thanksgiving. It's the drippings from some piece of meat over the fire or in front of the fire, and then you add things to that. So I've got some different meats, and I've got some mushrooms and some other veggies I'm going to add to that to make myself a force meat, which will wind up being a spread on my entree. I'm just going to mince up my mushrooms here. Earthy kind of a touch here. I don't need many. That's going to be good for what I'm doing.
Okay, so the first thing that I have to do is get this water boiling. It's going to take a while over this fire. I don't know when I'm going to use it. I don't know how I'm going to time that just yet, because the lobster will only take 8 minutes to cook, but then it's got to cool down before I can process it. I just want the water to boil so it's ready to go when I need it. I've got to wait for this fire to take off so I have some nice coals to work on. So I forgot a paring knife. Sometimes when you're cooking on the frontier, you don't have everything that you wish that you had. So I'm going to be paring these apples with this big chef's knife, and it's going to take me a little while. The apples are going to go in the pork a la Norman. What's going to happen there is they're going to give these really nice, sweet, soft pops inside of this really rich dish that's got a buttery gravy, lots of rich things going on, but they're going to be these pops of apple and even some lemon zest in there to give it some brightness.
They were familiar with the same onions we use today. They would refer to a yellow onion as a Spanish onion. And then they would use some of the phrases we use also now. Boiler onions, these are boilers. They're just immature, medium-sized onions. I'm just using part of one of these. This is gonna simmer so long, all this is just gonna cook down to nothing anyway. I'm getting some black peppercorns on this. But I've got allspice or Jamaican pepper, and I use white peppercorns. I'm just gonna let this simmer for almost an hour of our 3 hours here. It just, all these components have to break down and thicken. I may add some flour toward the end if it's not thick enough. I hope to reduce the liquid content by half. So it's just gonna sit on the side simmering. My entree is an olive. And in this time period, olive could mean the olive that you eat with a Bloody Mary, or it could also mean to stuff or to spread. And I'm producing a pork olive. I'm gonna take what is essentially a pork chop, and then I'm gonna take this reduced, thickened spread that on the piece of pork, roll it up, brown it, and then bake it. I need some red wine. I'm using just an inexpensive sweet wine. Can you smell it?
Yeah,
it
smells really good.
You wanna taste it? It's okay.
Wait till that.
Yeah.
This is our beautiful piece of pork that we're going to make the pork a la Norman with. I'm just going to cut it up into some chunks. And I think that that's going to be the main ticket here, is to get all this kind of busy work done, and then you can have time at the end to pay attention to details. I'm not sure how much John is going to be judging us on presentation, how something looks, and a lot of times 18th century food can kind of just live there on a plate not looking too pretty, although they did have a lot of really wonderful plate presentations. I want things to look good, because I know that you eat with your eyes first and then with your hands and your mouth. So when it comes to the table, I want to look nice and pretty.
I know Michael and Ryan really well. They know me. It's going to be a lot about their choices of their original dishes and how they pull those off. I know they cook well. If it were me, and, getting creative, this is the Great Frontier Cook-Off, and one of the choices is seafood. What are you gonna do there? If it were me, I'd try to find crayfish and do something with that. That's tricky. I doubt we're gonna see any crayfish today. We'll see what they do bring.
As I said earlier, I'm gonna be producing wafers in a wafer press. I've got an early 1800s wafer press that I'm gonna use. What I'm gonna produce next is a raspberry jam, which also just needs to set for a while. And that's going to go inside the wafer.
Is that cooking fast?
Well, I would say it's cooking a little fast. We're okay. It's not going to hurt it.
See that Michael's already got stuff in saucepans boiling on the surface.
Well,
what's going on over there? I'm just cutting up meat still.
You're just cocky. You're a cocky.
I'm not I'm saying I'm behind.
A cocky young cur is what you are.
I'm behind is what I am. Look at you cooking already.
Yeah. You got time. You'll learn.
Michael is not a lie-down opponent. He is really good. I've got to bring my A game if I'm going to beat him.
Yeah.
But I have to beat him.
Honestly, I'm excited that you want to do this. It's fun. I haven't done this before, and
I haven't either.
Probably won't do it again.
But the thing is
it depends on if you win or not. I may retire if I win.
We camp together at events throughout the year. We've got time in the vehicle together. I need to have this. I can't hear from him over and over again of how he won. I can't have our friends coming up to me at events saying, I can't believe you let Michael beat you.
I can't believe it.
I got to win.
If those chickens get much closer, I may change my mind about what the fricassee is going to be consisted of. I'm just going to take sugar and throw it in here. I'm gonna get it warmed up first. Once it's been going for a while, I'll just set it aside. It'll just sit here for another couple hours and the whole thing will cool down. I'll stir it occasionally, but it'll thicken. The pectin will be released out of those little seeds and it'll thicken. I want it cold for my dessert. I don't want it hot. I don't want it to melt the whipped cream. I'm just gonna get that. It's one of those things I'm gonna get done early and just have it set aside so I don't have to worry about it. So I just want to stir this a little bit and get it all uniformly warmed up. You can see what's already happening before I even mash it.
We're gonna dust this a little bit with flour and make sure that everything's just real coated. Then we're gonna throw some butter in the pan. We're gonna brown this pork. We don't want it wet, but we also don't want it dry. That's looking pretty nice right there. When we brown this pork, we're gonna start to create a roux. We're gonna start to create a wonderful gravy for this pork all-in-one. I don't know anything that Michael's making. And I'm trying to think, he said he hasn't made any of the dishes that he's making today. And I don't think I have either, although I've seen some of them made. So right now we just got a nice tender sear on all this pork. I don't want to push it too much. I'm gonna go ahead and get this off the heat. Go ahead and put the apples and the onions all into this pan that's got all this roux going on. And later we're gonna combine everything together and put it in the Dutch oven.
I'm just gonna mush the daylights out of these raspberries. I made these raspberries, this jam, in my very first video I shot with John. And we put them in, and we rolled up some pancakes, some thin pancakes. I've never made the wafers on location before, so I've only done them at home. So I haven't experimented with any of these. So I'm just gonna let this sit now. I'm done with it simmering. I need to taste this. I don't want to kill John. I may just stop and just do that. That will win just right there.
What you got?
Another thing. You just keep going. Can you see the chickens? They've been our friends. And if you could just pan where I stand, and then just look at where Ryan's standing, and then you understand why the chickens are Ryan's best friends.
I don't want this to cook down too much. I just want to start the process of getting everything married together. I'm pulling the apples and the onions on and off the fire just to regulate the heat. I don't want them to cook too much. I just want to get all these flavors started married together. But I don't want to soften it a whole lot because it's going to stew here in a minute. All right, so now the pork, some cider, everything is going to go in the pan together. Going to get going, and I'm going to get in the Dutch oven. It's going to stew for a half hour, 40 minutes. We're going to get some lemon zest going on in here for a bit of brightness, a little bit of acidity. It's going to make you take a bite and be like, wait, what's going on here? And take another bite. Just depth of flavor, something to make the judge go back again and again, trying to figure out what's going on. Also, remember, I know who I'm cooking for.
Do you think that's enough nutmeg?
There's never enough nutmeg. This is where we're starting. I mean, there's enough nutmeg for me, not for the man. It's time to put it on the fire.
We're about 45 minutes in. From now on, I think I'm gonna jump in there, start asking questions, seeing what they're doing, because I think they're going off the rails. Seafood was one of the choices.
Yeah.
Your choice is?
Lobster.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is that a real frontier-y kind of thing? This is a great frontier cook-off, right?
Well, it depends on where you're at in the frontier, I guess.
It's that's not okay. I'm gonna give you that one. I'm gonna give you that one.
Thank you.
Okay, so you decided not to use the whole lobster, just
I know that, yeah, just the lobster tails.
Yeah.
I know that you are not historically the most seafood loving person ever. So I think that I can cook this lobster, chop it up small, get a lot of flavor out of it into a fatty broth, and make sure that it's just really delicious. That's the point.
So my batter for my wafers is pretty simple. A couple of spoonfuls of cream, a couple spoonfuls of sugar, and a couple spoonfuls of flour. And they ask for orange petal water, which I could not find to save my soul. So I'm just going to introduce a couple of drops of orange juice into it. I know that's very intense, but hopefully it'll disseminate in the rest of the fluid, because the orange petal water is very mild. Because I don't know what it's going to do. I think that's it. The recipe is 1769, so I just don't know what the intent was. I'm going to do the best job I can with what I've got. Ryan has only picked things that John likes.
I think things that I like.
Bless his little heart. So
John just happens to like.
I'll be right back. So the next thing I'm going to do is melt some butter. Because I've made my batter, I need to butter the surfaces of my iron. And then I heat it. And then I pour some wafer material in here, and yeah,
It's gonna happen
It's
because
gonna-
these wafers are not easy to do.
they're hard to do.
I mean, we did wafers in a couple different episodes,
Oh,
and
yep, I don't remember seeing that.
the Gunston Hall one, and then Ivy and I did wafers, and challenging. If you
Yes.
do it like the recipes, they're very challenging.
No,
So you're gonna fake it.
no, I'm just gonna keep churning them out, and if they turn out good, that's great, and if they don't, they don't. All right, we are gonna get this baby ready. Now, I gotta think about this. Mock me, they're gonna make it to the table. I may get 2 good ones out of 20 tries, but they're coming to the table. Even if I have to steal that timer and turn it a couple more times.
We are 1 hour in, 2 hours left. 2 hours left, guys.
I'm not positive what's gonna happen here, so we're gonna. They're impossible to pull off, and I'm making a mess on John's table. I don't think I'm hot enough. I think you're right on this one. Like I said before, it's a fine line between not hot enough and too hot.
How'd that first wafer turn out?
Well, it didn't, and
Well, the first one never turns out.
well, we're gonna see how this goes. It's the first of several, I think. Most of these are high risk, high reward.
I'm nervous about Michael making wafers. If he can pull it off, that might win it for him. They're hard to pull off. They're really hard to do. I'm using bread for 2 different reasons. One is, along with the pork au Normand, I am going to serve cheese toasties. The other reason is I'm going to make a white pot, and white pot needs bread. It's a bread pudding. I'm feeling like I need to get my thoughts together real quick. I gotta wash some dishes. That's what I gotta do.
Try number 2.
Try number 2. I have no body. It's too thin, or my batter's too thick, and they want it thin. I think I have to be hotter.
With white pot, you're essentially making a custard. I'm nervous about it because it's not a dish I've made before. I've made bread puddings, I've made custards, but this one has an expectation of, it's really one of our favorite dishes. And so if I don't pull it off, I'm gonna get docked points. I'm making this up as I go a little bit, which is how I like to cook. Now we need to put some sugar in here. We need plenty of it. A little bit of nutmeg.
Wait a minute. Let me see. What are you doing here?
White pot. We're doing a white pot.
Obviously, you're cheating with that right there.
I'm gonna put allspice in it as well.
Okay.
It calls for nutmeg, believe it or not.
Okay. I just
Well,
didn't want
there's
you to play favorites.
Oh, me?
I need to come up with another concoction for dessert. Or just serving a bowl of raspberry jam with whipped cream, which I'm not want to do yet.
You're giving up on the wafers.
Not yet. I've only done 2.
Michael's trying to do wafers. Good luck, Michael. I've worked on wafers for hours, and unless you have the wafer iron just really hitting, I think it's really one of those things, probably in the 18th century, that was done in a kind of a factory setting where they would spend all day making wafers, because once you get going, you just keep going. But in this setting where there's a time constraint, it might take an hour before you start getting a good wafer. So that's a wager.
This is gonna be some well done lobster. I forgot about my lobster. The color looks good. We'll see. We just don't want it to be rubbery.
Well, here are the lobsters, probably the tails here. They're probably overcooked. This is the fun part of this episode because we're not fixing it as we go. Like in a regular cooking episode, If there's a mistake or we need to do it a second time, you don't normally see that. Sometimes we show that in an episode. In this episode, we're not cutting any of those out. If they mess up, if it doesn't work, you're going to see it. And if he struggles to get these lobsters to be edible, then so be it.
Has Michael even made a wafer yet?
No, I've tried two.
I've got 2 dishes going.
I noticed that your lobster was in about 3 times as long as it should. John will enjoy chewing on a rubber ball.
Oh yeah. You see that? That looks good right there.
Now what I don't know is if I'm supposed to put it back in there or if this is hot enough. Nope, I think we're done with this. I'm making an announcement, Ryan. I'm scrapping the wafers. Although it's against my nature, I don't have enough time to keep fussing with this, and I'm going to keep rolling. I didn't bring anything extra for a dessert, but I have something I can turn into a dessert. And so that's what I'm going to do. And so my next adventure is making a force meat to put inside that pork that we discussed earlier.
I've got a well-buttered dish here. I'm going to lay in some bread, and that's going to be kind of the top of this pudding. So now we're just going to pour our custard in here. And I don't know, that floated right up. And I don't think it's supposed to. So I'm going to have to...
I wonder how it's supposed to work.
Yeah,
I got an idea.
I bet you do. What's your idea? This is what I'm going to do. First I'm going to add bread to this and see what happens. Because I think that might cram in there, stick together, and make the right consistency. If that doesn't work, I'm going to scrap this whole thing. I'm going to make a rice pudding, but I'm going to be behind if I do that. Already, I can see that this is starting to help. I'm going to add some currants to this now and see what happens.
Okay, so I'm producing a force meat here. I'm just going to cut up some bacon and mince it up, actually. I use some lard. I'm going to throw some breadcrumbs in here. Sometimes they call for flour, this didn't. Parsley, little mace, not a lot. Use some salt. That bacon is salty, so I won't need much. I made mushroom ketchup at an event earlier this year. I dried the mushrooms and all the other ingredients I had. So it's really dried mushrooms and salt and allspice and a bunch of different things I had in there from that recipe. Another onion. And this is going to be treated just like my good gravy here. I'm just going to want to simmer it. That's good. Daddy's little helper. Just a thin cut pork chop is all it is. I'm going to cut the bone out of this. I'm going to get this to about half its thickness. I think this is going to shrink up a little bit while it's baking. So it's not really going to be this big. I think it'll probably be at least a third less its size when I'm done with it. There's some bacony, oniony goodness here. I'm going to wind up using the same skillet I produced my force meat in. Put a little lard in there so my pork doesn't stick.
The oven temperature, I can just tell, is way too low. I didn't do a good job while cooking, keeping the oven temperature up. So rather than hope for the best, I'm going to put a fire in there with it and try to bake with the fire in there. Well, that's happening. I've got my pork all in Norman sitting to the side. It is pretty much finished. I'll warm it up right before we go to plate. Now it's time to work on the lobster fricassee. And this sauce is kind of complex. We're going to really work on folding in a really good sauce here. So that's what I'm going to start working on right now. Right now we're going to work with some beef broth. I've got some butter in there for fat, a little bit of water. And I'm going to put 2 halves of a lemon in there just to cook and get some acid in there. That's so good.
1 hour? How are you doing?
And we're in great shape.
Everything's speeding up now? Oh, you're easy peasy, right?
I'm easy peasy, yep.
No problem. Okay. Looking good. They're starting to wear out. We're definitely more than halfway, and you can see the energy level come down on these guys. They're starting to get tired. Things aren't working. This isn't easy. Pulling off a meal with these many things in it all at once in this kind of a setting, it's not easy.
I'm feeling every moment of 68 years old. I'm gonna start a white fricassee of mushrooms. We're on the home stretch here, and I'm feeling pretty good.
Did they really?
Just fantastic.
If nothing else, that's a home run. I forgot the mushroom ketchup seasoning.
There's nothing good about this situation. These ovens are meant to come up to temp and bake with no fuel inside of them. They're not like a pizza oven, or they weren't used like that in the time period very often. I'm using it like a pizza oven right now, which means I've got a fire on both sides of this pudding, and it could very well burn. I just strained out this broth that I made. It had some beef broth. It had onions, water, salt, pepper, and some lemon for acidity. I'm going to put it back in here after I've scummed it. And now we're going to try to thicken it up a little bit and add even some more acid to it. So we're going to add, where did I put it? Oh, wine. We're going to add some butter and some cream. Thicken it up a little bit. So I'm just trying to get this sauce to thicken up right now by adding a little bit of flour at a time and stirring it continuously so we get a nice gravy going on here. This recipe called for wine and lemon, and I think it's too acidic.
Wait. We're changing the recipes? Why don't you just put Louisiana seasoning in it? It's so much better.
You have something to cook over there?
I'll fix that if you want.
So what I was trying to say is I'm trying to make sure that my seasoning is correct so that it balances everything. Because that acid in there is really nice.
Nice save. So one of the ingredients we need to use is cheese. So this is a cheese loaf, Henry Howard's 1727 cookbook. It's cheese curds. During the cheese making process, you gather the curds and you squeeze them in a press, and that is your cheese. So it doesn't say to discard all the way, so I'm gonna discard some of it. There's some breadcrumbs in here and a little mace, a little nutmeg.
Don't you think nutmeg is kind of cheating at this point?
I never bring recipes that call for it. This one actually called for it, so I brought it.
Are those marshmallows?
No, they're cheese curds. They want me to bake this in a stone vessel, stoneware, and pull it, open its top, put a little butter in, keep it out of the mold, put it back into brown, and that'll be...
Okay.
Yeah, we're gonna see.
That's a challenge.
Yeah. Well, this is everything I don't think I want to serve cold. The rest of the things I don't want to serve cold, so...
So I've got a blue tube. Come on. We're going to go get... Oh! See, look what happened. You see that fire? That wasn't like that when I left, but that's what I want. Because I would rather burn this and have to trim some of it for presentation than it not set up. I don't know. I don't know how John's going to judge, but Michael's not going to give a whole lot of room for error. He's very good. I've never cut into a lobster tail without using kitchen shears. So we're going to figure this out right now. Oh, this looks great. I'm excited about this. I think that after it soaks in this broth a little bit, it's a little bit over, but I think we're gonna be all right. There we go. That's gonna be better that way, because I don't want him to be eating this and being like, where's the lobster at? So here we go. All right, there's our lobster fricassee.
You got 1/2 hour, guys. That's it. That's all you've got left. Well, they have just 30 minutes left, and we'll see if they can pull this together.
23 minutes, Michael.
Yeah, I'm gonna boil a potato in 23 minutes because I forgot to do it. Shrimp's buttered. Oh yeah, I need sippets. I want my butter melted, but I don't want it so hot that it scrambles, so that it cooks the egg. Egg and wine and butter, that's it.
Good. It's all good.
A little salt.
How's that looking?
Not close. Well, I'm gonna do this.
What you making?
Whipped cream.
Are those done, you think?
No,
No?
you gotta go pink.
Ooh, we're doing all right. It might be a little underdone in the middle, but I'm gonna let it sit right here. We're gonna let that be. This is looking pretty good. I'm gonna cut this cheese up for some Welsh rabbit. Now it's time to start thinking about not only finishing the dishes, but how are you going to heat everything back up that's already done. Make sure that it's good when it comes to the table. So this last half hour or so is going to be high stress.
Gotta check this loaf. It's
We have 5 minutes left.
Make my cheesy toasties happen right now. Michael, how can I help you?
make me a Bloody Mary.
Ivy, you want some cheesy bread?
Ivy. Got raspberries here.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Put down your spoons.
That was good.
Good job, buddy.
Fun.
Yeah, it was fun.
We're gonna start off with Ryan. What should we start off with?
I don't know. I would save the dessert for last.
Okay.
And then whatever you want to do.
I think we've got some good color. I think the plating was nice. You know, got some nice color here and there, and so I think they look good. Let's find out. Here's our pork a la Norman, which is sort of like a really thick pork stew.
Yeah, with apples. It's like with cider and everything. It's very
Yeah.
appley.
Yeah. Yeah. The apples and the pork. Really good. You did a great job with that. This is the fricassee, right?
Yeah.
And it's the lobster fricassee, which I have never noticed in the cookbook before.
I was very excited to find it.
Which, remember which cookbook it came out of?
I've wrote it down. I don't remember off the top of my head. It's not one that we carry.
Right.
And my goal was to try to find a seafood fricassee
Yeah.
so that I didn't have to make four dishes.
Two things at once, yeah. Get ready.
Bottoms up.
Maybe just too much salty. Other than that,
Okay.
whew, man, good. And I'm a kind of a salty person, so.
Okay.
I
I tasted it and it was like, man, that's really acidic. Maybe some salt will help with that. I probably shouldn't have done that.
No, but the lobster seems, good. You were worried about being too tough.
I was, yeah.
No, it's good. So how did this white pot turn out? We were really worried about it.
I was really worried about it. When I first pulled it out, it didn't seem like it's set up in the middle. And so I thought, well, I can still plate the edges, right? And but I decided to leave it at the door of the oven to see if it would finish. And it did. I left it there like 20 minutes and it finished out. I was really excited.
And you made a sauce for it.
I did.
See that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Texture's perfect, especially with the top here. It's got some, thickness to it. And, the raspberries look good. So,
How's the mint with it? I didn't know. I just did it I thought maybe it would smell fresh. Take it, leave it.
yeah,
Okay.
It looked good on
Okay.
there. I don't know about boy, I could eat that all day. No, that's
I
good.
probably should have done it.
No, excellent. Well, here it is, Michael,
Yep.
looking like a typical table setting in the 18th century. Very
Yep.
nice. I see you brought a drink, which is
Bribing the
kind,
judge, yes.
unlike somebody else's, but that's all right. What have we got here?
Well, for our hors d'oeuvres, we have a cheese loaf. It's cheese curds and some other things too fierce to mention, baked and served as and then shrimps buttered.
Right.
It takes care of our seafood
Right.
and our cheese. Entree is a pork olive and a white fricassee of mushrooms and a potato pudding, which I didn't pudding because
Yeah.
I didn't plan wisely.
Okay.
My time. And then for dessert, we have a raspberry with cream.
So this is the cheese loaf,
Yeah.
and this one's from Newest Way, all the way 1726.
1726.
Yeah.
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 It's different, I know.
What kind of cheese was that?
It's just a cheese curd, mozzarella cheese
I
curd.
think it needs that butter on top. So we've got in our shrimps here, buttered shrimp. Well, how can you go wrong? Buttered shrimp.
There's lots of ways.
Yeah.
Let's see. That's got wine and egg and cream a little bit. This didn't have a lot of seasoning. I let the wine and the shrimp take it.
Right.
I could have salt and peppered it, but that's not what it called for. So. And then the mushroom fricassee.
Okay, this is your fricassee, huh?
Yep.
Very winey.
It's less winey than they said. They were wanting me to have equal parts of some
Wow.
things. I cut
Wow.
back on that. And it's a cheap white wine, a sweet wine. Once again, they just say white wine.
Yeah, a
And
mountain
I'm
wine.
thinking of
or
what they
whatever.
would have had.
A potato pudding, huh?
Well, what is missing is I didn't flour a piece of linen and boil it, bring it out, and spread copious amounts of sugar on top, which is what the recipe called for. So at the last minute, I gave you potatoes, which is better than nothing.
Okay,
So I missed the
well-
pudding boat. For that alone, I don't deserve to
Oh, the pudding boat. We
Yeah.
missed it.
win it. Yep. I set sail and just on the horizon, it was lost with all hands. The SS pudding.
The olive is very
pork
interesting.
olive.
It's like a stuffed, basically pork choppy kind of, a pork loin or something like
I
that.
made a good gravy. I made a force meat, spread the force meat on it, rolled it up, browned it, and then let it simmer in the gravy. So the force
What was
meat's
in the
got-
force meat?
Oh, brother, bacon, a little beef, a little pork, mushroom ketchup, the dried,
Yep.
and a little red wine, butter, mushrooms,
Yeah. You got some nutmeg in it, make sure?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
as far as you know.
Very nice.
There you go.
Very nice.
I've got more of that came from. I would do that twice before you start judging.
So obviously you had some struggles. What were the difficulties?
I spent too much time trying to get the wafers to work, and I simply forgot to have a container of boiling water, so I didn't get the pudding done. So that's one thing I didn't do. Everything else I did, and they are the tastes that per the recipe. I didn't fuss with them. We can not like it today because it doesn't have some seasoning that we're used to, but it's not the way it was. So trying to get these to be the way they were.
The competition is over, and these gentlemen, Ryan and Michael, did a wonderful job. We don't normally do something like this where it's timed, where we have to see the mistakes, where we have the struggles. It was fun to watch, especially as I'm relaxing on the other side, watching you work. So very, very nice, and you all brought great dishes. Do you have any last words before I give my final judgment?
It was fun. I'm not used to so many things in a time. I'm used to doing a couple of all day, every day. So that was fun and interesting. I wouldn't mind doing it again, whether I win or lose this time.
Very good.
But I wouldn't change what I did. I brought things I hadn't done before for the most part, except for 1.5 things. And I don't know that I'd change that. I'd probably do the same thing again and have some successes and some failures.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd never even seen this lobster fricassee until last night, and it was fun to just bring it and try it. A lot of dishes that I've seen on the channel from before I worked here or before I was doing any cooking, so it was a lot of fun. Thank you, Michael, so much for coming and
Ryan,
doing it.
Thank you.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
My pleasure.
There are a lot of different ways we can judge food like this, historically and taste-wise, and even the choices. I think if I was looking at sort of the main dish and the historical concept, I think I'm going to go with the olive, because I that's not something that's done a lot, and I really like that. The pork a la Normand had a great taste, but it's a little trickier to research and lock down. And so that one's a little iffier if you really want to bring out the paperwork and say, okay, that's where this one is based off of.
It's kind of like the guts of a Cheshire pork pie.
It is.
But without the pie.
Right. So that one's a little trickier. The side dishes or the, Michael's appetizer of the cheese curd, I like the idea, especially where it's coming from. I don't know about the taste part of it, though.
It was flat.
Yeah.
It
right. But if you're
per
judging
the recipe, but
if you're judging it on historical, here's an interesting dish, then yes. If you want a, this is the appetizer that is the yummiest. Well, the cheese bread.
It's just cheating.
Yeah, it's just totally cheating. But it is right out of the books. It's very historical. So there's that. I certainly fricassee wise. Hey, obviously the lobster fricassee nails it, even if it was just that little bit too salty. And when it comes to dessert-wise, well, Ryan, the white pot, hello. This one, you have struggled with those wafers.
Yep.
That's too bad. You probably should have fought those a little bit more at home so you could come in and just nail those
But
wafers.
he needs points for trying wafers. That's really difficult.
Truly, I mean, if you're looking at, difficult level, but he wasn't able to pull that off.
Yeah.
If he could have nailed those and brought them in, then yes, but there's no wafers here.
Yep.
So, and the white pot, boom, even though you struggled with getting it baked right.
Yeah, right.
So, hey, really, really good. Now it's time to announce the winner of the first Townsends Great Frontier Cook-Off. Ryan, he did it. Now, there were some good ones here. You did a great job, Michael. But overall,
good job, baby.
Ryan did it.
I'm so excited. Thank you, Michael. Worthy opponent. It was very fun. I am so excited. I can't believe I won.
You should have won. Those are great dishes.
Very happy.
Thank you so much for watching this first experimental episode. If you're interested in another one, please tell us in the comments.
We understand today that there is a difference between bourbon and whiskey. We don't always know what it is, but we understand culturally that there is a distinction. In the time period of the 18th century, whiskey was whiskey, and it didn't look like this. It looked like this. I lived in Kentucky for 10 years of my life. Now I'm not a native to Kentucky, and if you are from Kentucky or generally from the South, you can smell that on me. I'm not from down there. Lived up here in Indiana when I was younger, and I moved down to Kentucky, and as soon as I did, I hear this word bourbon. Bourbon, bourbon, bourbon everywhere. And there are a lot of really strong feelings about bourbon versus what people call Tennessee whiskey. Down in Kentucky, it is not uncommon to walk into a household, say you're going over to a friend's house, and somebody proudly says, not all whiskey is bourbon, but all bourbon is whiskey. And what they're doing there is they're making a clear distinction that there's something special about their Kentucky bourbon. They want people to know this is bourbon. In fact, you'll even hear that for a bourbon to be a bourbon, it has to be made in Kentucky, which is not true and it never has been, but that is part of their heritage. They're proud of that. You will hear people say that the reason that bourbon is special and needs to be made in Kentucky is because of all the limestone that the water is filtered through in Kentucky, and because the climate in Kentucky is perfect for storing all throughout the year bourbon in barrels in these big barns that hold it at distilleries. And if you go into one of those barns and you smell it and you take it all in, it is a sight to behold, and it is wonderful for the senses. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, even though I am not a Kentucky native, I was drawn into this. I love bourbon. And I'll tell you, to this day, even if I go into a grocery store or a liquor store and I'm looking for a bottle of bourbon, if it is not distilled in Kentucky, I will not buy it. And that might seem silly to a lot of people, but that is something that is special to me, and it's probably because of my time living in that state. The reality is that until I started researching bourbon for historical context, I didn't even realize that it wasn't even regulated until 1964, which blew my mind. And what it means to be bourbon is it has to be a 51% at least corn mash bill, and it has to be made in the United States territories, which was almost disappointing to find that out, because I believed, man, this has to be made in Kentucky. The late 18th century is where I've been focusing most of my research, and at that time, whiskey is not top dog as far as alcohols are concerned. People are really liking brandy, then comes rum, then comes whiskey. And that's because things like brandy taste like what's coming from France, and rum has been used for a long time. That's very strong as far as the British are concerned, and it's being imported like crazy. Whiskey is being made here, made out of necessity. Farmers are distilling whiskey because they don't want their crops to go bad. If you're a farmer at this time in history, your fields are plentiful. The grains are going crazy because this ground is so fertile, especially corn. As you're harvesting your corn, you need a way to not have waste. You can't store that corn forever and it just not go bad. You can turn it into alcohol. You can bottle it up and you can store that for a long time, and along the way, you can turn that into money by selling it. You can use it as a currency by bartering and trading. It turns into part of your household budget, and it stores forever without spoiling. So we're not only talking about corn. You can distill pretty much any grain into an alcohol. And if you look through historical cookbooks, they're going to go through grain after grain after grain. There's buckwheat whiskey, there's all kinds of whiskey. But it's a way for farmers to be able to pull from harvest and not have anything ruined. Another rule that people know and recognize about bourbon is that it needs to be stored in charred white oak barrels. That wasn't happening in the time period. These farmers were doing most of the distilling. There weren't a lot of huge operations, and they weren't making enough to fill up a barrel. They're storing it in jugs. And a lot of the color that we see from bourbon nowadays, that's coming from that charred white oak barrel. That's one of the reasons that we don't have that. Now, they weren't even storing it for super long because they're turning that into income. And so when it comes out white and it's lean and it's young, they're storing back what they need for themselves. They're using the rest to turn into currency because their household still has to move, and they still have to make money out of those crops, even though it's not being sold as corn. So where does the name bourbon come from? And we're so stuck on this name now, but in the time period, they weren't. There were lots of distilling operations throughout the West, right? So Virginia is distilling a lot. So is Kentucky. You see it a little bit in Indiana, but mainly Pennsylvania and up in Maryland. There's distillation happening in all of those places. And whiskey, it's on the come up. It's starting to catch on. A lot of people still aren't sure how much they like it, but it's happening. And like I said, it's happening so that crops don't go bad. So bourbon itself, there's a lot of folklore. There's a lot of assumptions as to where the name comes from. And there are a lot of claims that this is the true one, this is the right one. But really, I'm not sure. And I don't think anybody is actually really sure where the name bourbon comes from. What is known now as Bourbon County, Kentucky was actually part of Virginia in the time period. In 1785, they started to split up some counties. It eventually becomes part of the state of Kentucky. Popular folklore says that the bourbon or the whiskey that was being taken out and exported from Bourbon County, Kentucky was marked with the word bourbon, and that's where the name comes from. Other people say that it was a rich whiskey culture down in New Orleans, and that's where the name comes from. Some people say that Elijah Craig was the first person to make bourbon whiskey. Now, there was a lot of whiskey being made around him. What do you guys think? What have you heard about bourbon? What's the true story? Let me know in the comment section. So let's imagine for a moment that we're in the late 18th century and you're traveling. You come across a public house, you're gonna stay at the tavern, and you walk in and you want some whiskey. This is gonna be what the proprietor pushes towards you. This is the whiskey. Let's take a taste and see what it's like, because it's not anything like what we're used to. It's not bad, but it's not great. It's not aged. It's not treated over time. When we taste a white whiskey like this now, it can leave a little bit to be desired. We're used to bourbons that have been aged in these white oak barrels for several years, and they're more rounded. They're not so lean and mean, but it's still good. It's fine. What was really popular in the time period was to make a brandy or a rum punch, and you start to see whiskey coming in as the alcohol in those punches. So we're gonna make a punch right now. For that, we're gonna need about 4 ounces of sugar, 12 ounces of water. Then we're gonna use 6 ounces of the white whiskey with 6 ounces of citrus juice, maybe a little bit of zest and a sprinkle of nutmeg. Super simple, you can do it at home and it's gonna taste fabulous. Our whiskey punch is finished. It looks great. It smells really good. It smells like a complex lemonade because it's got all these different citrus fruits in it. It's very sweet. You can smell the whiskey just a little bit. We'll see how much of it you can taste here in a minute. First, I want to thank Brian Cushing from the Victorian Barroom channel. Thank you so much for your help in making this episode. It was really wonderful to be able to take my research and run it past somebody who's been researching this forever, and he is just a wealth of information. All right, let's see what's going on here. Ooh, yeah, that's really good. That's really good. The whiskey's there. You can't smell it, but you can taste it, but not overpowering. It's just right there in the middle. Okay, what do I think after all that research? In the time period, whiskey was a whiskey. They're making it from different grains, but whiskey's whiskey. Now, all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. Could you imagine America without coffee? This is a country where the average person consumes a little over 3 cups of coffee per day. In the 2019 to 2020 season, we consumed 3.3 billion pounds of coffee. But if it wasn't for the events on December 16, 1773, we might not drink coffee at all. Coffee has a very rich history worldwide and in the USA, and nobody really knows the exact origin story before coffee started being shipped all over the globe. We do know that somewhere around the Arabian Peninsula is where coffee was first being cultivated, and then it moved into areas like Egypt and Persia, modern day Turkey, and that's where it really started to take root. You start seeing coffee houses develop, and it starts becoming part of the culture for the people around there. So here's a reading from an historical account of coffee by John Ellis, and this is from 1774. It says, as much is spent in private families in the article of coffee in Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul, as in wine in Paris, and relates that it is customary there to ask for money to drink coffee, as in Europe for money to drink your health in wine or beer. So what he's saying here is that coffee is so popular and so embedded into the culture in Constantinople. He's comparing that to wine in Paris. That goes together like bread and butter. It doesn't get any more popular than that. So let's do a quick lesson on what coffee is and where it comes from. So what's happening over here in the Arabian Peninsula is they're harvesting from coffee trees. We call them coffee beans, but it's really seeds inside of little cherries on trees. And so what happens is you harvest those seeds, and then they'll be washed, and they'll be dried, and they'll be waiting, they'll be stored away so that they can be shipped wherever they need to go, and then people will roast them. And when you roast coffee, you start to open that coffee up. What happens is it cracks this first time, cracks a second time. As it's opening up, the chaff breaks off, and that color starts to happen, where you go from something that's gray or green to something that looks brown, black, cinnamon, depending on how far you take that roast. And in the time period, they're roasting coffee very dark. That is what they're looking for, a nice, rich, dark, oily coffee. How does coffee get from the Arabian Peninsula and Egypt into Europe? Well, there are a lot of theories, and I'm not sure that anybody knows the exact one. Some people say it came through Germany first, some people came through Italy first. It eventually lands in France and creates just this huge hub of coffee houses and culture. In Italy, people are afraid to drink it. They're like, this bitter drink must be from the devil, and they actually have to have the Pope come and try it. He really enjoys it, and he says, this can't be from the devil, so go ahead. It's crazy what's happening. It's creating fuss and controversy along the way, but eventually it's accepted to the point by the mid-17th century, London has 300 coffee houses by itself. Let's talk about coffee houses really quickly. Coffee houses became, it's kind of strange, they became these bohemian kind of artistic type headquarters, and they also were these like very intellectual, higher knowledge discourse kind of headquarters. Political discourse was happening. They became known as penny universities at one point because for the cost of a cup of coffee, you could have intellectual discourse and you could learn a lot. You could speak with people that had been places and done things. There was one coffee house in London that I was reading about that was adjacent to a theater, and playwrights would spend time in there. They would have this system on the wall where they would move a plaque, whether a play was good or bad, that was happening across the street as a kind of rating system. So there's all kinds of stuff that's happening in there, but it's never boring. There's always something to talk about. There are always interesting people to talk to, and it's just this hub of creative thinking. In the mid-1600s, coffee comes over to America, and it isn't long before it catches on. People are coming to America from other countries where they're already used to drinking coffee, and if you drink coffee, you know that once you drink coffee, you don't give up coffee. So there's this culture that starts to build here. Coffee houses start happening, but tea is still the #1 drink. And it isn't until tea starts to be encroached upon and taxation comes in that the colonists don't agree with, that coffee starts to boom. In 1769, tea, which is the colonists' favorite beverage, starts to become very heavily taxed. And they're not having it. They don't agree with it. They don't want any part of it. So they start to revolt. They're looking for different hot beverages to replace tea. In just 3 years from 1769, the consumption of tea in the colonies fell from 900,000 pounds to 237,000 pounds. The East India Company was in trouble. What's happening in the colonies now in the early 1770s is we have civil unrest that's beginning. We have coffee houses rising up and people are organizing. They're talking revolution. They are not happy with how things are going, how they're being governed by the British. Meanwhile, the East India Company is hemorrhaging money. They're bleeding and they're having a lot of trouble. So to solve that problem, Parliament passes the Tea Act in 1773. It's not a new tax. It's almost creating a monopoly where you have to, or not necessarily have to, but some folks might not be able to get tea anywhere else. And the East India Company is getting discounts so that they're the #1 tea provider. That doesn't make the colonists happy at all, and there's this powder cake that just blows up. On December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty snuck on the merchant ships carrying British tea, and they dumped 92,000 pounds of tea into the Boston Harbor. This was the first true act of defiance in the Revolutionary War, and from that point on, for the colonists, tea is not had. Coffee is king. This is a journal read from Nicholas Creswell in 1774. There's an election that's happening, and he says the candidates gave the populace a hogshead of toddy, what we call punch in England. In the evening, the returned member gave a ball to the freeholders and gentlemen of the town. This was conducted with great harmony, coffee and chocolate, but no tea. This herb is a disgrace among them at present. Many times in Nicholas Creswell's journal, when he mentions tea in the colonies, he says this is a disgrace, this herb is forbidden here. They are not drinking tea, but he's always drinking chocolate, and he's always drinking coffee. People in this time period were even serving punch in bowls that were made as protests to what was happening with the East India Company, with the taxation, without representation that they felt. They were gathering together at bars and homes, and they were drinking against the king towards revolution. Coffee only continues to rise in popularity in American culture until its peak at post-war 1946, when people are drinking 46 gallons per person in America per year, which is an insane amount of coffee. It eventually plummets a little bit, it falls. Soft drinks come out in the 1970s and it has a big dip, but we always, as a country, are drinking twice as much coffee as tea at 20 gallons per year per person, and tea never really comes above 10 gallons a year per person. Right now in our country in 2023, coffee is booming, and it has been for a while. There are coffee roasters, micro roasters, huge operations starting up all over the place. My wife and I own a coffee roasting company. There are a lot of people who are getting their entire income off of buying, selling, roasting coffee. Now the question is, would any of that have happened if it wasn't for this one night in 1773 when a group of men decided their best mode of protest was to dump tea into the ocean? Can you trace this most popular drink that we have in our country that we consume every day all the way back to events that happened 250, 300 years ago? Can you imagine America without coffee?
We're in the middle of summer and we want something cold and refreshing. What can we find in the 18th century cookbooks that fits the bill? We've done ice cream before. Parmesan ice cream, brown bread ice cream. Very, very good. But sometimes ice cream is just too thick. We want something a little more refreshing than that. So, did they have anything like a sherbet or a sorbet? Yes, they did. They called it ice waters. The recipes read like a complicated snow cone or popsicle, but of course, we're going to be making these with real fruit. The idea of flavored ice waters is rather old. It really comes from the Mideast and the Turkish area, maybe 1000 AD. And it moves into Italy in the 15th and 16th century, and then by extension into the French cookery in the 17th century. Massiello writes a very popular French cookery book in the late 17th century. That gets translated in 1702 into this Court and Country Cookbook. Now, that's where this idea of ice waters first shows up in 18th century English cookery. Massiello's cookbook is very high-end cookery. That's probably the reason why we don't see these iced waters show in regular cookery, because ice is very, very expensive. It only shows up on the most expensive tables. But later on in the 18th century, ice becomes a bit more industrialized, and then flavored ice waters show up in regular cookbooks at the very end of the 18th century, say 1790s, and very popular in the early 19th century, 1808. What kind of flavors were they using for their flavored ice waters? All the classics that we would think of today. Cherry, strawberry, we've got raspberry, currant, apricot, peach. They also have the classic citrus flavors like lemon and orange. And if you can't get a hold of any of those fruits, maybe it's the wrong kind of season because these are very, very seasonal, you can also do chocolate. Right here in the 1702 cookbook, basically chocolate popsicles. I want to try multiple flavors today, but we'll start off with a simple one, and that is strawberries. Let me read to you this quick method of extracting the flavor, as it were. After the strawberries have been well picked and bruised, let the juice be mingled with such a quantity of water and sugar as may be sufficient to make a pleasant liquor. Then let all be clarified and strained, squeezing out the gross substance strongly to give the water a red color. This one's going to be easy. We'll just cut the very tops off of these strawberries, slice them up, smash them in a bowl, and then mix that with water and sugar, squeezing out all the solids and making sure to get a red color to it because the color is important to these. The color on the strawberry looks perfect. The next flavor I want to work on is lemon, and the lemon directions go like this. Having in a like manner squeezed out the juice of 3 or 4 lemons into 2 quarts of water, let the pulp and the zests be soaked therein with 1/4 pound of sugar during some hours, then strain the liquor. So the important part of this lemon is not just lemon juice. A lot of times we just think, oh, lemon flavor, we need lemon juice. And many of these 18th century recipes with lemon use more zest than they use actual lemon juice. We're gonna make sure to get some really, really nice, finely shaved lemon zest in this mix before we put in the juice. Let's do 2 more flavors. One is blackberries, because blackberries are in season, so that ought to be perfect. And also, let's do chocolate, which is the one that it calls for when you don't have any fruit that's in season. We covered chocolate kind of in depth earlier this year. Chocolate was a very, very popular breakfast drink. Now we think of chocolate and usually it's like chocolate bars, but in the 18th century, chocolate was usually a chocolate drink. And they could prepare that in a couple of different ways. And we talked about how that was done all the way from the raw beans until you get to the chocolate drink. And in this case, we'll be using a pre-prepared chocolate that's already got the sugar mixed in and everything. So it ought to be really easy and tasty. We need to freeze these in molds. They call for either a pewter or a tin mold. I've only got a couple of different ones to try out here. There's a little strawberry mold that's sort of like a pewter mold from the time period. They would have these hinged molds. Since this is fully liquid, we'll only be able to do half of this. I also have these little tart tins. We can try freezing those. We have to be really careful though, because we don't want the ice to fall into them. So we have to cover these molds up with something else so we can put ice on top of that. Or I've also got these little tin boxes. They've got a little lid on them so that we can pour some in there and put the lid on and then freeze that. As we dig into the later cookbooks that I talked about, 1808 and 1790, they don't bother to tell you too much about the method of freezing up these little frozen ice waters. But in 1702, Marcello does give us the method to freeze them up. Now, these are obviously done in the summertime, so you have to have a supply of ice. And then, just like we would do with a homemade ice cream, we use a large bucket of ice. We add in salt crystals, usually large crystal grained salt, and then that causes the salt to melt rapidly and get to a very, very low temperature, so we can freeze up our other pieces of water in there. They use pewter molds or tin molds, fairly small ones, so it's easy to freeze it up. And then they pack it up with ice over the top and take it out after a few hours. They also had ice cream makers, which you could maybe do this in an ice cream maker. And this is an 18th century ice cream maker. It's called a sabatier. And it's kind of like the ice cream makers that we have today with the, the big crank and the ice inside of it to make homemade ice cream. But this one is just empty on the inside. It doesn't have the dasher. And in a modern ice cream freezer, there's a dasher on the inside that scrapes the ice cream away from the inside surface so that it continually kind of mixes it and it makes it nice and creamy. They didn't have that in the 18th century, but they did have directions to take a spoon or a spatula and go in there and scrape it off manually from the inside. Maybe that's why there aren't that many recipes for it. It's very interesting watching the popularity of these ice drinks here as the time flows on. It's rare in 1700. By 1800, it's starting to become much more popular. And we find more and more references to ice houses, which totally makes sense, doesn't it? Even by 1806, they're starting to try to export ice from New England to other parts of the world like the Caribbean, and later on in the 19th century, in the 1830s through the 1880s, they're exporting ice to England and even all the way to India. I set these molds in the ice about an hour and a half to 2 hours. You know, it really depends on how big these molds are as to how fast they freeze up. This one froze up pretty quickly, and I didn't want it to get super hard or else it's really hard to, you know, cut it with your spoon and eat it. So I want them to still have some softness. Whoa, super, super good strawberry flavor. You know, today we're used to fake flavors, right? You don't get something that is just strawberries. And this one, without any fake flavors at all, is very, very good. Here's another one I'm really excited about. How did this chocolate turn out? This is the standard chocolate, just like we made in the chocolate episode. It really has a nice consistency. It isn't too hard, kind of broken up really nicely. Woo! You would think that this is like milk chocolate or whatever. There's no milk in here. It's just the chocolate and whatever sugar that's processed with it. And wow, it turned out perfect. The lemon flavor, wonderful. And the blackberry, intense. This method is so interesting that it is right out of 1702, but you would think it was something you get out of your freezer today.